The cold spring mud sucked at the frayed, torn hem of Ilara narrowed charcoal widow dress. She shivered. The wind bit deep. High above the chaotic town square, the auctioneer raised a heavy wooden gavel. It looked less like a tool of commerce and more like an executioner hammer. The brutal snap of the wood against the block echoed through the freezing rain. Her late husband's debts had swallowed the farm. They had swallowed the cattle. Now, the cruel men of the town sought to swallow her dignity. She stood on the rough pine planks, shivering, offered up like a broken plow to whoever would pay the final note. The faces below her blurred into a gray mass of sneering teeth and greedy eyes. She was a delicate thing, entirely alone, waiting for the final blow that would end her life as a free woman. Draw a little closer to the fire, friend. The night is long, and stories of survival in the cold frontier need a warm hearth to be told right. If you find peace in these quiet tales of healing, leave a like on this memory, subscribe to our Fireside Circle, and maybe drop a comment down below to share how you would face a crowd of cold hearts. Now, listen close to the wind, for the story is just beginning. The town of Oakhaven possessed no pity for the weak. Whispers hissed through the crowd like snakes in dry grass. The women in their pristine wool coats covered their mouths, hiding cruel smiles and exchanging vicious glances. The men jingled coins in their deep pockets, their eyes raking over her fragile frame. The smell of wet horsehair, raw earth, and stale whiskey drifted up to the wooden platform, making Ilara nauseous. She kept her chin tucked. Her trembling fingers found a loose thread on the torn hem of her dress. She rolled the coarse cotton between her thumb and forefinger, over and over, anchoring her mind to the tiny repetitive motion, so she would not collapse under the weight of their collective malice. Her heart battered against her ribs, panic clawed at her throat. She was entirely defenseless. In the quiet sanctuary of her own mind, her emotional reflection turned inward, wrapping around the hollow ache in her chest. She had spent 2 grueling years nursing a sick husband, draining every ounce of her spirit and youth to keep him comfortable, only to be left with a ledger full of staggering debts and a town eager to punish her for his failures. She was nothing to them but a living, breathing debt, a problem to be sold off and swept under the rug. The sheer injustice of it all burned in her throat, but she had no strength left to scream. A harsh, booming voice cut through the drizzle. A local mill owner, a man known for working his hands to the bone and starving his mules, raised a thick finger. He offered to buy the paper, claiming he needed a scullery maid to scrub the blood from his butcher blocks and tend to his vicious hounds. Laughter erupted from the crowd, a cruel joke, a public humiliation designed to break her spirit completely. The auctioneer smiled a greasy, toothy grin and raised his gavel to accept the pitiful, insulting offer. Ilara closed her eyes tightly. The world narrowed to the terrifying sound of the falling hammer. The hammer never fell. A shadow, massive and dense, blocked out the gray daylight. The mocking laughter died in the throats of the townsfolk. A collective, breathless silence swept over the muddy square. Heavy, measured footsteps crunched against the gravel and sloshed through the thick mud. The crowd parted like water before the prow of a massive ship. Thorn stepped out from the thick mountain mist. He was a mountain of a man, clad in heavy canvas and worn leather suspenders. His broad shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the timberline itself. Rain glistened against his thick, well-kept dark brown beard. Deep-set, piercing amber eyes scanned the crowd. He did not boast. He did not swagger. He simply existed, radiating a quiet, terrifying authority that demanded absolute obedience from every soul in the square. The air around him felt heavy, charged with the promise of sudden violence if provoked. The mill owner stepped back, his cruel smirk melting into genuine terror as the giant locked eyes with him for a fraction of a second. Thorn walked straight to the wooden platform. He did not look at the auctioneer. He reached into his heavy canvas trousers and produced a thick leather pouch. The sound of solid gold striking the auctioneer ledger was louder than the gavel. The coins spilled out, catching the weak daylight, heavy and undeniable. It was a fortune, 10 times the debt she owed. The auctioneer stared at the gold, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, unable to formulate a single coherent thought. The giant mountain man turned his back, on the greedy townsfolk. He stepped squarely in front of Ilara, positioning his massive frame between her fragile, trembling body and the biting wind that whipped across the square. The sudden absence of the freezing gale was a profound relief, allowing her violent shivering to ease just a fraction. He stood like a shield of flesh and bone, completely absorbing the hostility of the town, so it could no longer reach her. He looked down at her. His amber eyes were not filled with pity, nor did they hold the predatory gleam of the men in the crowd. They held a deep, unshakable calm. Without speaking a single word, he raised one large calloused hand and gestured toward the thin shawl, slipping from her delicate shoulders, inviting her to pull it tighter against the cold, without daring to touch her himself. It was a profound gesture of respect in a place where she had been treated as cattle. Ilara blinked, her emerald green eyes wide with shock and confusion. She clutched the shawl tighter, her fingers brushing against the torn hem of her dress once more. Thorn noticed the frayed fabric. He looked down into the mud near her boots, where her only worldly possession, a small woven bag containing her mother Bible, had fallen into the freezing muck during the jeering. He knelt, an act that made the townsfolk gasp in collective disbelief. A man of his terrifying size and undeniable power bowing into the mud for a destitute widow. He retrieved the muddy bag with massive hands, brushing the worst of the dirt away with his heavy thumb. He offered it back to her with a slow, respectful nod. The sheer contrast between the viciousness of the town and the gentle, careful movements of this towering giant left Ilara entirely breathless. For the first time in years, she felt a strange, terrifying spark of hope ignite within the deep well of her exhaustion. The debts were paid. The cruel men were silenced. But the sheer size of the man standing before her presented a new unknown fear. She belonged to the mountain now, and to the silent king who ruled it. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating for the townsfolk, but strangely peaceful for Ilara in the shadow of the giant. Thorn turned his massive head, leveling a gaze at the auctioneer that promised total destruction if the man dared to speak. The auctioneer hastily stamped the ledger, his hands shaking violently as he gathered the gold and scurried backward off the platform. Thorn gestured toward the edge of town, where a massive black draft horse stood ground-tied in the rain, indifferent to the weather. He did not command her. He simply offered the path away from the pain. Ilara hesitated for only a second. The town offered nothing but mockery and a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cruel cuts. The mountain man offered the terrifying unknown, but he had shielded her from the wind and treated her with dignity. She stepped off the platform, her small boots sinking into the mud. Thorn walked beside her. He adjusted his stride, slowing his long, sweeping steps to perfectly match her exhausted, fragile pace. They reached the massive horse. He reached up, effortlessly unhooking a heavy woolen blanket from the saddle horn, and draped it over her shivering shoulders. The smell of wood smoke, pine needles, and clean rain wrapped around her, grounding her racing mind in the immediate tangible reality of the moment. The heavy wool trapped her fading body heat, stopping her trembling entirely. He offered his cupped hands. She placed her small boot into his massive palms. With a single fluid motion, he lifted her weightless frame into the heavy leather saddle, as if she were made of dry leaves. He swung up behind her, maintaining a careful, rigid distance, ensuring his broad chest did not press against her back. He took the reins, his massive arms framing her on either side without trapping her. The giant horse turned toward the deep timberline, leaving the stunned, silent town behind in the muddy rain. The thick mist of the deep woods swallowed them entirely as they began the steep ascent. The noise of the world faded away into the rhythmic thud of hooves on wet earth and the sighing of the wind through the pines. Ilara closed her eyes, exhausted beyond measure, leaning just an inch backward, testing the space between them. Then, the giant spoke for the first time. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the damp air, carrying a weight that made her blood run entirely cold. "Not can ove kep, what your husband buried beneath the floorboards," he murmured. "And not know who is coming to dig it up." The chilling declaration hung in the freezing mist. Ilara stiffened, her heart seized in her chest, buried beneath the floorboards. Her mind raced frantically through the hollow memories of the rotting farmhouse she had just lost, desperately searching for any hidden truth her late husband might have concealed. There had been no wealth. There had only been empty whiskey bottles, broken promises, and the crushing weight of unpaid ledgers. If there was a secret hidden beneath the splintered wood of her former prison, she knew absolutely nothing about it. She dared not turn her head. Fear gripped her throat. She expected a threat, a demand for answers, a harsh grip upon her fragile shoulder. Instead, the rhythmic, thunderous heartbeat of the massive man behind her remained perfectly steady. He did not press her for information. He did not tighten his hold on the thick leather reins framing her waist. The silence stretched, deep and impenetrable, swallowing her panic and leaving only the rhythmic, heavy thud of the giant draft horse carrying them higher into the treacherous timberline. The muddy trail narrowed into a steep, winding switchback. The chaotic noise of the town faded entirely, replaced by the profound, ancient quiet of the towering pines. The scent of raw earth and wet horsehair gave way to the sharp, clean fragrance of crushed needles and the biting metallic tang of incoming snow. Ilara sat rigid in the heavy saddle, her delicate fingers white, knuckled the small, muddy woven bag resting in her lap inside. Lay her mother Bible, the thick embossed leather, offering the only tangible connection to a life before her misery began. She traced the rough, dried mud flaking off the woven fabric, a subtle, desperate behavior to ground her spiraling thoughts. The torn hem of her charcoal dress draped over the horse's dark flank, a miserable flag of her former humiliation. The wind howled down the jagged canyon walls. A vicious crosswind of icy sleet whipped across the exposed ridge, threatening to tear the heavy woolen blanket from her shivering shoulders. Before the freezing squall could bite into her delicate skin, Thorn shifted his immense weight. He leaned forward just a fraction, angling his broad, heavily muscled shoulders to create an impenetrable wall of canvas and bone. Between her and the storm, the wind battered against his thick flannel and leather suspenders. Yet he did not flinch. He absorbed the full, brutal force of the mountain gale, leaving Ilara seated in a pocket of calm, entirely shielded from the freezing assault. It was an unspoken, primal act of protection. She released a long, shaky breath. A quiet, emotional reflection bloomed within the tight confines of her chest. Hours ago, she had been a piece of discarded property, standing on a wooden block, waiting for the cruelest citizens to devour her remaining dignity. She had expected to be dragged into a life of violent servitude, scrubbing butcher blocks until her hands bled. Now, she was ascending into the terrifying unknown, captive to a giant who spoke in riddles but shielded her from the wind. The deep-seated trauma of her past commanded her to remain terrified of this massive, imposing stranger. Yet, a strange, creeping relief began to thaw the edges of her panic. For the first time in her adult life, she was not the one bearing the brunt of the storm. The path leveled slightly, carving through a dense grove of ancient evergreens. The heavy draft horse snorted, stepping carefully over exposed, frost-covered roots. Thorn pulled gently on the thick leather reins, bringing the massive beast to a halt beside a rushing silver ribbon of an alpine creek. He dismounted with surprising, silent agility for a man of his towering stature. His heavy and scuffed leather boots crunched softly against the pristine white frost. He stepped to the edge of the rushing water, giving her space. Ilara stared down at her hands. The mud from the town square had dried into a painful, cracking crust over her fragile knuckles. She felt disgusting, unworthy of the pristine mountain air surrounding them. Thorn returned to the side of the horse. He did not demand she dismount. He did not bark orders. He reached into the deep pocket of his canvas trousers and retrieved a clean, neatly folded square of white cotton cloth. He held it up to her. He did not force it upon her. He simply offered it, a silent invitation to wipe the filth of the valley away. She hesitated, her emerald green eyes darting to his weathered, sun-beaten face. His deep-set amber eyes held no judgment, only a steady, unyielding patience. Her trembling fingers reached down, brushing against the rough calluses of his massive palm as she took the cloth. The simple, pristine cotton felt like a luxury against her battered skin. She scrubbed the dried mud from her hands, clutching the cloth to her chest when she finished, unwilling to part with the small comfort. Thorn checked the saddle girth, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle her. As he prepared to mount, he noticed the heavy woolen blanket had slipped, exposing her thin, shivering left shoulder to the biting mountain air. With agonizing care, the giant reached up. His massive scarred fingers pinched the thick woolen fabric, avoiding even the slightest brush against her pale porcelain neck. He tugged the heavy wool back into place, tucking it securely over her shoulder to trap her fading body heat. The sheer, overwhelming contrast of his terrifying size and the delicate, painstaking care of his hands left Ilara utterly breathless. He swung his massive frame back into the saddle behind her. The horse resumed its slow, steady climb. Ilara stared at the snowy path ahead, her mind desperately trying to categorize her new reality. She needed to understand her usefulness. She could not accept something for nothing. The mountain of gold he had dropped onto the auctioneer ledger required payment. "Moat can scrub floors," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the crunching snow. "Moat can mend heavy canvas. Moat know how to stretch rations through the hardest freezes. Moat will earn the coin you spent. Moat will not be a burden." The giant remained silent for a long, agonizing mile. When he finally responded, his deep, gravelly voice vibrated through the damp air, carrying no malice, only a heavy, immovable truth. "Moat did not buy a servant," he murmured. "Moat bought your freedom from a town that did not deserve to breathe the same air as you. You owe no debts on my mountain." The absolute certainty in his tone shattered the remaining defenses around her weary heart. A hot, silent tear tracked down her pale cheek, soaking into the rough wool of the blanket. She had spent her entire existence bracing for the next blow, the next demand, the next cruelty. To be told she was simply free, sheltered by a giant who asked for nothing in return, felt like a fairy tale spun from snow and pine needles. The dense trees finally broke, revealing a vast, breathtaking clearing near the summit. The snow here was untouched, a pure white canvas stretching toward a massive, hand-hewn log cabin nestled against a sheer granite cliff face. It looked like a fortress, built to withstand the end of the world. Thick smoke curled from the fieldstone chimney, promising immense warmth and absolute safety. Ilara felt a profound, heavy exhaustion wash over her. They had made it. The cruel world was miles below them, lost in the muddy rain. Thorn pulled back on the reins. The massive horse stopped dead at the edge of the clearing. Ilara opened her eyes, ready to embrace the quiet sanctuary. She froze. The heavy, reinforced oak door of the impregnable cabin hung violently ajar, its iron latch completely sheared off. And leading up the pristine, snow-covered steps of the porch was a fresh, deep trail of muddy, staggering boot prints passing straight into the dark interior of the home. Thorn swung down from the heavy draft horse. He did not speak. He did not hesitate. His massive hand dropped to his heavy leather belt. Cold iron rasped against canvas. He drew a heavy, terrifying woodsman hatchet. Ilara stopped breathing. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The icy mountain wind howled across the clearing. He moved with impossible silence. A giant stalking unseen prey. He did not crunch the pristine snow. He drifted up the porch steps and vanished into the dark, splintered doorway of the cabin. Elara sat completely frozen in the heavy saddle. The heavy woolen blanket offered warmth, but the terror bleeding into her veins turned her blood to ice. Her delicate, pale fingers clamped around the small, muddy woven bag resting in her lap. She traced the hidden, embossed leather cross of her mother Bible through the damp fabric. She rubbed the hidden shape over and over, a desperate rhythmic anchor to keep her mind from shattering into 1,000 terrified pieces. She waited for a shout. She waited for the deafening crash of a brutal struggle. Nothing came. Only the deep, mournful sighing of the evergreens. A long, agonizing minute passed. Then, the giant emerged from the shadows. He lowered the hatchet. His stoic, weathered face betrayed no fear, but his heavy square jaw was locked tight with quiet fury. He walked back to the massive horse and reached up, offering his large, calloused hands. Elara slipped her small boot into his palm, and he lowered her fragile frame to the snowy ground with agonizing care, ensuring she did not stumble. He guided her up the porch steps. The heavy oak door hung loose, the iron hinges completely sheared by brutal force. Elara stepped across the threshold. The devastating smell of overturned, cold wood ashes, raw pine splinters, and damp, rotting leaves assaulted her senses. The cabin had been violently ransacked. Flour dusted the heavy plank floors like a second layer of snow. Every cabinet hung open, but the true devastation lay in the center of the room. A massive, beautiful hand-hewn bed frame, clearly built to support the giant massive frame, had been chopped into hundreds of jagged splinters. The floorboards beneath it had been brutally pried up, leaving dark, jagged holes, exposing the frozen earth beneath the foundation. Nailed to the central support beam with a rusty spike was a torn sheet of heavy ledger paper. Thorn pulled the spike free. He handed the paper to Elara. She stared at the jagged, heavy handwriting. Her vision blurred. The breath rushed out of her lungs. It was Malachi, her late husband, eldest brother. A man of vicious greed and absolute cruelty. The debt is blood. Moat want the deed he stole from the family before the rot took him. Moat will tear this mountain down to find the widow, and Moat will take it from her flesh. A quiet, devastating emotional reflection settled over Elara's fragile shoulders. She closed her tired emerald eyes. The crushing weight of ultimate betrayal crushed the last of her hope. Her husband had not just died a failure, he had died a thief. He had stolen from his own ruthless blood, hidden the prize, and left his innocent, desperate wife behind as the sacrificial lamb to absorb their wrath. She was entirely alone, hunted by vicious men for a sin she did not commit. And now, she had dragged this quiet, honorable giant into the center of her nightmare, destroying his sanctuary in the process. Thorn ignored the threat written on the paper. He did not demand answers. He did not yell. His soul, unyielding focus remained entirely on her fragile, shivering frame. He righted a heavy, overturned wooden chair, testing its stability with his massive weight. He gently guided her by the elbow, seating her near the stone hearth. Without a moment of hesitation, the giant knelt among the ruins of his own home. He gathered the shattered, jagged splinters of his beautiful, ruined bed frame. He piled the wood of his only comfort into the cold stone hearth and struck a match. The fire roared to life, feeding on the destruction of his sanctuary just to provide her shivering body with immediate, life-saving warmth. The heat pushed the freezing mountain air back into the shadows. Thorn moved to the small iron pump in the kitchen area. He filled a heavy iron kettle and placed it directly over the blazing splinters. Once the water boiled, he poured it into a thick, slightly chipped ceramic mug. He walked back to her side. He offered the chipped mug. Elara reached up with her bruised, fragile hands. Thorn did not let go immediately. He wrapped his massive, rough hands entirely around her small, trembling fingers, pressing her hands against the hot ceramic to ensure the heat instantly seeped deep into her freezing joints. The gentle, profound care in his touch stood in absolute defiance of the violence surrounding them. Ilara pulled the clean white cotton cloth from her pocket. She dabbed at the freezing rain and silent tears staining her pale cheeks. Thorn turned his back to give her privacy. He walked to the far, shadowed corner of the ransacked room. The intruder had ignored the tiny space. Tucked against the rough log wall was a small, fragile hunting cot. It was barely 2 feet wide, constructed of thin, creaking pine and a meager, flat mattress. It was a bed meant for a small child or a passing, desperate traveler. The towering mountain man unbuttoned his heavy, fleece-lined canvas coat. He slipped it off his broad shoulders, revealing the thick, flannel shirt beneath. He draped the heavy, pristine coat carefully over the tiny cot. He spent a long, quiet minute smoothing the thick fleece over the thin mattress, tucking the heavy canvas around the edges to build a soft, warm nest perfectly sized for her delicate frame. He stepped back and gestured gently toward the tiny cot, offering her the only remaining place to sleep in the ruined cabin. Ilara looked at the tiny cot, then she looked up at the towering, massive man standing before her. His broad shoulders blocked out the light from the lantern sitting on the table. He was a giant of immense, terrifying proportions. The small, fragile cot would not even support the weight of his boots, let alone his massive frame. He intended to sleep on the cold, drafty floorboards, having already sacrificed his only heavy coat and burned his own ruined bed just to keep her safe and warm. The dam holding back her shattered spirit finally broke. A violent, ragged sob tore from her throat. The sheer, impossible gap between her broken, hunted world and his massive, silent sacrifice was too much to bear. She wept bitterly, clutching the chipped mug to her chest, her tears falling freely onto the torn hem of her widow dress. She wept for the betrayal of her blood, the cruelty of the town, and the absolute unmerited grace of the giant standing before her. "You re bigger than my bed," she sobbed, the words tumbling out in a choked, devastated whisper as she stared at the tiny cot. "You have lost everything because of me. You cannot sleep on the floor. You re too big." Thorn did not offer hollow, clumsy words of comfort. He simply watched her weep, his deep amber eyes filled with a profound, unbreakable resolve. He turned away from her tears. He walked past the blazing hearth and knelt beside the jagged, dark holes in the floorboards where his bed used to be. He reached his massive arm deep into the frozen, exposed earth beneath the cabin foundation. His heavy shoulder muscles flexed against his flannel shirt. With a sickening crack, he tore a hidden, false beam away from the foundation block. He stood up, pulling a heavy, rust-covered iron lockbox from the frozen dirt. He walked to the table, setting the heavy box down with a deafening thud. Without searching for a key, he raised his heavy iron hatchet and brought the blunt edge down on the lock, shattering the metal into jagged pieces. He pushed the heavy lid open. He reached inside and pulled out a stack of pristine, neatly folded documents. He walked over to Ilara, who had frozen mid-sob, staring at the shattered lockbox. The mountain man gently pulled the chipped mug from her trembling hands and set it on the hearth. He placed the heavy stack of documents directly into her delicate lap. Ilara looked down. Resting on top of the stack was not a deed to a farm, nor a ledger of stolen family gold. It was a pristine, formal adoption certificate, dated 2 years prior, bearing her late husband's signature, legally binding a child she had never met to her own name. Ilara stared at the heavy parchment resting upon her trembling knees. Her breath hitched in her throat, catching sharply against the freezing air that swept through the shattered doorway. The ink was thick, dark, and undeniable. It was a legally binding document, stamped with the heavy wax seal of the territorial governor. She dragged her pale, shaking thumb across the rough edge of the paper. Her mind utterly refused to process the words laid out in perfect, damning cursive. Tobias, a boy of 6 years, legally bound to her late husband, and by proxy of marriage, bound permanently to her. Her lungs felt incredibly small. The air thinned. Panic clawed mercilessly at her chest. For 2 agonizing years, she had nursed a dying man who had sworn they were entirely alone in the world, cursed by bad luck and a barren home. He had watched her weep over empty cradles. He had watched her endure the crushing pity of the town. Yet, beneath the floorboards of this remote hidden mountain sanctuary, he had concealed the existence of a living, breathing child. She did not scream. She did not throw the paper into the blazing hearth. Instead, a quiet, devastating emotional reflection washed over her fragile frame. The sheer weight of the betrayal anchored her to the heavy wooden chair. Her own blood, her sworn partner, had used her as a blind shield. He had left her behind in the muddy valley to absorb the absolute wrath of his vicious brother Malachi, all to protect a secret she kept absolutely nothing about. Her husband had not hidden gold. He had hidden a life, and in doing so, he had effectively signed her death warrant. Thorn did not crowd her. He did not ask prying questions, nor did he demand an explanation for the document resting in her lap. The towering mountain man possessed an ancient, unyielding patience. He stood quietly near the blazing remnants of his ruined bed frame, watching the terrifying storm rage outside his shattered cabin. He knew the freezing wind was dropping the temperature inside the room to deadly levels. He knew the tiny, fragile hunting cot in the corner could never support his massive weight. She had kept bitterly at the undeniable truth that he was entirely too big for the only remaining bed, and he had absorbed her tears without a single word of protest. He turned his broad, heavily muscled back to the blizzard. He moved toward the heavy oak table, where Ilara sat frozen in her shock. He reached out with his massive, calloused hand. With painstakingly slow, deliberate care, he adjusted the small brass knob on the side of the oil lantern. He turned the wick up just a fraction of an inch. The warm, golden light bloomed softly across the heavy parchment, perfectly illuminating the dark ink while saving her exhausted, tear-filled emerald eyes from straining in the deep mountain shadows. It was a tiny, profound act of grace in a room filled with brutal destruction. Next, he walked with heavy, silent steps to the stone hearth. He picked up the slightly chipped ceramic mug she had been clutching earlier. He poured a fresh, steaming measure of water from the heavy iron kettle. Returning to the table, he placed the hot, chipped mug squarely over the top right corner of the adoption certificate. The heavy ceramic anchored the fragile paper against the vicious drafts swirling through the cabin, while simultaneously offering her frozen, bruised fingers an immediate source of heat. Ilara looked up, her vision blurred with unshed tears. Thorn stood before her, clad only in his thick, worn flannel shirt and heavy canvas trousers. He had sacrificed his only winter defense, leaving his heavy, fleece-lined canvas coat neatly draped over the tiny hunting cot to ensure her delicate frame survived the freezing night. The icy squall howling through the sheared hinges of the door whipped at his dark brown beard, yet he did not shiver. He did not brace against the cold. He was a force of nature unto himself, immovable and absolute. He reached down to his heavy leather belt. His massive hand wrapped around the thick hickory handle of his woodsman hatchet. He turned away from the warmth of the fire. His broad shoulders squared entirely toward the raging blizzard outside. "Where are you going?" Ilara whispered, her voice cracking beneath the weight of her terror. "You will freeze. You cannot survive out there in just a shirt." Thorn paused at the ruined threshold. He did not turn his head. He simply looked back over his massive shoulder, his deep-set amber eyes finding hers in the lantern light. He looked at the shattered remains of his massive bed frame burning in the hearth, then at the tiny, inadequate cot in the corner. Finally, he offered her a slow, silent nod of absolute reassurance. He was not abandoning her. He was answering her tears the only way he knew how. He stepped out into the blinding, freezing darkness. The silence inside the cabin stretched tight, completely suffocating in its intensity. Ilara sat alone with the ghosts of her husband lies, her delicate fingers wrapping tightly around the warm, chipped mug. She traced the jagged edge of the ceramic, a small, subtle behavior, to ground her spiraling, frantic mind. She stared at the torn hem of her charcoal widow dress, feeling the absolute weight of her destitution pressing down on her shoulders. Then, it began. A sharp, massive sound cracked through the howling wind. The sound of heavy iron violently biting into frozen heartwood echoed down the jagged canyon walls. It was a deafening, terrifying noise, born of sheer, undeniable physical power. Ilara flinched, pulling the heavy woolen blanket tighter around her shivering shoulders. She slowly pushed herself up from the heavy wooden chair. She walked tentatively toward the shattered, open doorway, keeping her fragile body hidden in the shadows. She looked out into the chaotic, swirling white darkness of the mountain storm. Through the dense, blinding snow, she saw him. The giant mountain man was standing waist-deep in a pristine snowdrift at the absolute edge of the treacherous timberline. He had chosen a massive, towering alpine pine, a tree that looked as old and unyielding as the mountain itself. His broad, heavily muscled shoulders heaved with immense, terrifying power. He swung the heavy iron hatchet in a wide, punishing arc. The brutal mountain wind battered his unprotected flannel shirt. The freezing sleet lashed against his weathered, sun-beaten skin. Yet he did not falter. He did not slow his grueling pace. He struck the frozen timber over and over again, driving the heavy iron deep into the dense core of the tree. The sharp, overwhelming smell of raw, sweet pine sap suddenly bled into the biting winter air, riding the wind straight into the ruined cabin. Ilara stood in the doorway, utterly breathless. The rhythmic, thunderous ringing of the woodsman axe became a steady, anchoring heartbeat in the terrifying night. He was not chopping firewood. The massive, ancient tree was entirely too large, too green, and too dense to burn. He was felling raw timber. He was carving a new foundation out of the frozen earth. Unable to offer her clumsy words of comfort, to ease her broken spirit, the stoic giant was offering his own body, enduring the freezing agony of the blizzard to physically rebuild the safety she had lost. He was building her a new bed with his bare hands. The sheer magnitude of his sacred sacrifice brought a fresh, overwhelming wave of tears to her exhausted eyes. She backed away from the howling doorway, unable to bear the sight of his grueling labor any longer. The contrast was staggering. The men of the town had mocked her. Her own blood had betrayed and abandoned her. But this towering, silent stranger was currently tearing a mountain apart in the freezing dark, just so she would not have to sleep in fear. She retreated to the heavy oak table. She sat down heavily, her knees shaking violently beneath her torn dress. The lantern light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the ransacked room. The steady, heavy rhythm of the axe continued outside, wrapping around the cabin like a massive, impenetrable shield of sound. Ilara reached for the chipped mug. She lifted it away from the corner of the heavy parchment. As she moved the ceramic, the edge of the adoption certificate curled slightly upward in the cold draft. Beneath the thick, official parchment, a second, much smaller piece of paper fluttered against the wooden table. It was a torn scrap of heavy ledger paper, entirely different from the thick, legally binding document above it. She set the mug down on the hearth. She carefully pulled the small, jagged scrap of paper into the warm circle of the lantern light. It was a frantic, rushed note, scrawled in the familiar, messy handwriting of her late husband. The ink was heavily smudged, as if written in a desperate, terrifying hurry. Ilara leaned closer, her heart hammering violently against her ribs as she read the chaotic words. Malachi knows. He does not want the land. He knows the boy carries the true family deed in his blood. Mort cannot protect him in Oakhaven. Mort have paid the stage driver to take him high into the timberline. Mort told the boy to hide in the old trapper cave near the summit. Elara froze. The air in her lungs turned completely to ice. She looked at the dates scribbled frantically at the bottom of the jagged scrap. Her pale, delicate hands began to shake uncontrollably. The date was exactly 3 days ago. If Mott do not return, the note concluded, the handwriting devolving into a terrified scrawl. Do not let Malachi find the cave. He is bringing the hounds. They will tear the boy apart before he ever sees the mountain peak. The jagged scrap of paper trembled violently between her pale, delicate fingers. 3 days. The words echoed in her mind, a terrifying, inescapable drumbeat. A 6-year-old boy, a child she had never met, had been abandoned in a freezing trapper cave near the summit. He had been alone for 3 entire days while a brutal mountain blizzard buried the timberline. Hunted by a ruthless man and vicious hounds. The air in the ruined cabin felt suddenly thick, suffocating her with the absolute horror of her late husband's cowardice. Panic seized her throat, tight and unforgiving. She gripped the torn hem of her charcoal dress, her knuckles turning completely white. She had to tell the giant. She had to stop his grueling, magnificent labor, shatter the fleeting peace he was building, and send him back out into the deadly, blinding white night. She pushed herself up from the heavy wooden chair, her legs shaking terribly beneath her skirts. She turned toward the shattered, open doorway, clutching the frantic note to her chest. Before she could take a single step, the massive doorway darkened entirely. Thorn returned from the howling void. He did not walk. He advanced, dragging a massive 10-foot section of raw alpine pine through the driving snow. The sheer physical power required to move the frozen, dense timber was staggering. His heavy canvas trousers were soaked through, and his thick flannel shirt clung to his broad, heavily muscled shoulders, dark with melting sleet and physical exertion. He hauled the heavy log across the threshold, his scuffed leather boots finding absolute purchase on the flour-dusted floorboards. The rich, sharp, overwhelming scent of sweet pine sap and fresh snow flooded the ruined room, instantly overpowering the damp, depressing smell of wet ash and destruction. As he crossed the room, the vicious mountain wind followed him, whipping a freezing draft directly toward Elara's fragile frame. Thorn did not drop his heavy burden. He did not issue a command. Instead, he smoothly altered his path. He drove his heavy boot against the solid oak table, shoving the heavy furniture sideways across the floor with a deafening scrape. He angled the thick wooden top perfectly, wedging it between the open doorway and her chair. In a single fluid motion, he had created a massive, makeshift windbreak. The biting gale instantly vanished from her skin, deflected back into the storm. Elara sank back down into her chair, utterly breathless at the casual, immense strength of the man. He dropped the massive pine log near the blazing hearth. The impact shook the floorboards. Without taking a moment to rest, without acknowledging the freezing wetness of his own clothes, the giant knelt beside the raw timber. He raised his heavy iron hatchet. He did not swing with the brutal, violent force he had used in the forest. Now, his movements shifted into a rhythm of painstaking, deliberate creation. He angled the heavy iron blade, using the sharp edge to meticulously peel away the thick, rough bark. Elara watched in quiet, absolute awe. The ringing of the hatchet softened into a rhythmic, steady, scraping sound. Long, beautiful ribbons of pale wood curled away from the trunk, revealing the pristine, unblemished heartwood beneath. The golden light from the lantern danced across his weathered, sun-beaten face, highlighting the deep concentration in his piercing amber eyes. He was carving a massive, enduring foundation, entirely focused on restoring the safety that had been stolen from her. A profound, quiet, emotional reflection washed over her exhausted spirit. Every man she had ever known had only taken from her. Her late husband had taken her youth, her inheritance, and her peace, leaving behind a legacy of lies and hidden debts. The men of the town had tried to take her dignity, eager to break her for their own amusement. But this towering, silent mountain man took nothing. He only gave. He took the raw, violent nature of the wilderness and shaped it into a foundation of absolute peace. His heavy labor was not a chore. It was a silent, unyielding vow of protection, etched into every swing of his blade. She traced the rough, dried mud, clinging to the small woven bag resting beside her on the table. Her fingertips found the hidden, embossed outline of her mother Bible inside. It was a subtle, desperate behavior to ground her spiraling mind. She felt entirely unworthy of the sheer magnitude of his sacrifice. She was a broken, hunted thing, yet he treated her space as if it were a sacred sanctuary. Thorn paused his grueling labor for a fraction of a second. He wiped the heavy sweat from his brow with the back of his massive forearm. He glanced toward the table, his deep-set eyes landing on the chip mug she had left sitting on the stone hearth. He reached out with the blunt, flat back of his hatchet and gently, carefully nudged the heavy iron kettle an inch closer to the ceramic mug. It was a silent, gentle reminder that the water was still hot, an unspoken command to keep her fragile body warm while he worked. The weight of the torn ledger paper burned against her palm. She had to tell him about the boy. Ilara stood up again. Her emerald green eyes locked onto his broad back. "Thorn," she whispered. Her voice was incredibly small, nearly swallowed by the crackling fire and the howling storm outside. He did not hear her over the scraping of the wood. He shifted his immense weight, bringing the hatchet down to shape a deep, perfect notch into the end of the log. As he worked, a pile of sharp, jagged pine splinters and heavy wood shavings gathered on the floorboards, spilling dangerously close to where she stood. Thorn stopped. He lowered the heavy iron tool. He knelt lower, leaning his massive frame toward her small leather boots. With a slow, sweeping motion of his calloused, bare hand, he pushed the sharp, dangerous splinters far away from her delicate feet. He cleared a perfect, clean circle of smooth wood around her, ensuring she would not catch her torn hem or step on a single piece of jagged debris. It was a tiny, devastating moment of nonverbal care that shattered the last of her emotional defenses. Tears spilled hot and fast down her pale porcelain cheeks. How could she ask this man to stop building her sanctuary? How could she ask him to march back into a lethal blizzard, risking his own life for a child that belonged to the bloodline of her tormentors? She stepped around the heavy oak table, moving into the direct light of the lantern. Thorn looked up. His massive hands went entirely still upon the raw pine. He saw the tears shining in her eyes, and his strong, square jaw tightened instantly. He dropped the hatchet. He rose to his full, terrifying height, his broad shoulders tensing, as if preparing to fight off whatever invisible demon had caused her to weep. Ilara held out her trembling hand. The tiny, jagged scrap of paper fluttered in the draft. "He left the ledger," she murmured, her voice cracking violently beneath the weight of her fear. "My husband?" He left a note hidden beneath the adoption paper. Thorn did not reach for the paper immediately. He looked at her fragile, shaking fingers, then slowly brought his deep amber gaze up to meet her tear-filled eyes. He waited, his silence a deep, anchoring well of patience. "He lied to me about everything," she sobbed, the words tumbling out in a desperate, broken rush. "There is a boy. A 6-year-old boy named Tobias. He carries the true family deed, and Malachi knows it." Thorn remained perfectly still, a massive statue of flesh and bone illuminated by the firelight. He did not show shock. He did not show anger. He simply listened. "Nace," Absorbing the devastating truth, she was unraveling. "My husband abandoned him," she whispered, the horror of the realization completely crushing her spirit. "He paid a stage driver to drop him high on the mountain. He told the child to hide in an old trapper cave near the summit. The note, Thorn. The note is dated 3 days ago. That little boy has been alone in this freezing wilderness for 3 entire days." The giant mountain man slowly reached out. He took the jagged scrap of paper from her delicate fingers, his massive hand careful not to brush against her trembling skin. He looked down at the frantic, smeared handwriting. "And Malachi is hunting him," she finished, and her breath hitching in her throat. "The note says he is bringing the hounds. They will tear him apart." Thorn stared at the paper for a long, heavy second, the peaceful, rhythmic atmosphere of the cabin entirely replaced by a sudden, terrifying pressure. The massive man slowly lowered the paper. He turned his head toward the open, shattered doorway, his deep-set eyes piercing the chaotic, swirling white darkness of the blizzard. He stood perfectly still, his heavy chest rising and falling with slow, calculated breaths. Then, the wind shifted. The deafening howl of the mountain gale broke for a single, agonizing fraction of a second. And in that tiny pocket of silence, drifting down from the treacherous, icy summit above the timberline, came a sound that made Ilara blood freeze completely solid in her veins. It was a deep, resonant, echoing bay. The unmistakable, terrifying cry of a heavy hunting hound catching a fresh scent in the snow. The terrifying bay of the hound echoed through the shattered doorway, hanging in the freezing air like a death knell. Ilara stopped breathing entirely. Her delicate fingers crushed the jagged scrap of ledger paper. She waited for the massive mountain man to grab his heavy iron hatchet and charge blindly into the blinding white void. Thorn did not move. He stood perfectly still, his broad shoulders squared to the storm, his head tilted slightly as he listened to the howling wind. The deep-set amber eyes narrowed, calculating the distance, the echo, and the brutal reality of the mountain terrain. "They are in the lower gorge," he murmured, his gravelly voice vibrating with absolute, unshakable certainty. "The snow is falling too fast. It will bury the scent before they reach the switchbacks. The trapper cave is hidden behind a frozen waterfall near the summit. The ice will mask the boy. They cannot reach him tonight." The absolute authority in his voice acted as a heavy anchor, instantly grounding her spiraling panic. He was not abandoning the child. He was reading the mountain with the ancient, unerring wisdom of a man who ruled the timberline. He turned away from the storm. He walked to the heavy oak table he had used as a windbreak. With a massive heave, he shoved it squarely against the open, sheared doorway, blocking the worst of the freezing gale. He then retrieved 3 heavy, raw pine logs, wedging them violently between the table and the floorboards. He was sealing the cabin, transforming the ruined room into an impenetrable fortress for the night. "Mott will hunt them at first light," he whispered, his heavy square jaw locking tight. "But tonight, you will not freeze on this floor." He returned to the center of the room. He picked up his heavy iron hatchet and resumed his grueling, punishing labor. The rhythmic, thunderous ringing of iron against frozen wood filled the cabin once more. He worked with terrifying, blinding speed, his massive arms flexing as he carved deep, perfect notches into the massive pine logs. Ilara watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. The freezing draft had been blocked, but the cabin was still incredibly cold. The tiny hunting cot in the corner could not hold him, and the floorboards were exposed to the frozen earth below. If he slept on the bare wood after sweating through his heavy flannel shirt, the cold would settle deep into his chest. He would freeze to death before morning, and without him, neither she nor the boy in the cave would survive. A quiet, profound emotional reflection settled into her bones. For years, her late husband had mocked her domestic efforts, calling her sewing useless and her meticulous care a waste of time. But as she looked at the mountain of soft, curled pine shavings Thorn was producing with his hatchet, a sudden, fierce determination ignited within her exhausted spirit. She was not useless. She possessed the exact skills necessary to bridge the gap between his brutal, raw power and their shared survival. She knelt beside the small woven bag. Her trembling fingers bypassed the Mother Bible, reaching deep into the bottom to retrieve a small, heavily worn wooden spool of thick, waxed canvas thread and a heavy iron needle. She moved to the corner of the room, where the intruder had brutally shredded the original heavy mattress. The thick canvas ticking was torn to ribbons, and the raw wool stuffing was scattered across the flour-dusted floorboards. Elara fell to her knees. She gathered the massive, torn sheets of heavy canvas, dragging them toward the blazing hearth. She sat near the fire, her emerald-green eyes focused entirely on the heavy fabric. She threaded the iron needle with blinding speed. She began to sew. It was not delicate, ornamental stitching. It was furious, desperate, survival sewing. She pulled the thick, waxed thread through the heavy canvas with rhythmic, punishing force, anchoring her terrified mind to the repetitive, vital motion. She stitched the jagged ribbons of canvas back together, forming a massive, incredibly deep rectangular casing. Thorn paused his heavy labor. He looked over his massive shoulder. He watched her small, bruised hands flying over the coarse fabric, her delicate frame bent over the heavy work. He noticed the violent shiver racking her pale shoulders. Without a word, the giant mountain man walked to the stone hearth. He used his heavy, scuffed leather boot to push a large, flat river stone directly into the hot coals. He waited a single minute, then rolled the hot stone out of the fire. He used the flat back of his hatchet to slide the radiating stone across the floorboards, stopping it exactly 1 in from the toes of her leather boots. The intense, beautiful heat instantly seeped through her thin soles, warming her freezing blood. Elara looked up, her vision blurring hot, unshed tears at the profound, non-verbal warmth of the gesture. He offered a slow, silent nod, then returned to the raw timber. She worked tirelessly. Once the massive canvas casing was complete, she crawled across the floorboards. She gathered every ounce of the scattered, heavy wool from the ruined mattress. She stuffed it into the corners of the new casing, but it was not enough to insulate the massive frame he was building. She turned to the mountain of soft, curled pine shavings left behind by his hatchet. The shavings were completely dry, incredibly soft, and smelled heavily of sweet, fresh sap. She gathered them by the armful, packing them tightly into the massive canvas casing alongside the wool. The thick, overlapping curls of wood created a deep, impenetrable layer of insulation. The sharp, overwhelming tang of fresh pine sap mixed with the metallic, biting smell of the hot iron kettle over the fire. Thorn drove the final, heavy wooden peg into the massive bed frame. The sound echoed like a gunshot, signaling completion. He stepped back, his broad chest heaving. The new bed was a masterpiece of raw, mountain strength. It was massive, anchored directly into the heavy floorboards, built from thick, unyielding alpine pine. It was a fortress within a fortress, completely capable of holding his immense weight and sheltering her fragile frame. Elara stood up, her knees trembling from the grueling floor work. She dragged the heavy, completely stuffed canvas mattress across the floorboards. It was incredibly heavy, packed tight with wool and pine shavings. Thorn stepped forward immediately. He reached down, his massive, calloused hands effortlessly taking the heavy burden from her exhausted grip. He lifted the massive, beautifully sewn mattress and laid it perfectly into the heavy wooden frame. It fit flawlessly. The thick insulation immediately blocked the freezing drafts, rising from the exposed earth beneath the floorboards. Her homemaking skills had literally saved them from the deadly, creeping cold. The towering mountain man ran his heavy, scarred hand over the thick, perfect stitches she had sewn into the canvas. He traced the heavy thread with absolute, quiet reverence. He looked at her small, bruised hands, then back to the massive bed. It was a silent, undeniable acknowledgement of her absolute worth. She had not just watched him work. She had built the warmth that would keep them alive. Ilara walked to the hearth. She picked up the chipped ceramic mug, now filled with fresh, steaming water. She carried it to him, offering the warm ceramic to his raw, blistered hands. Thorn took the mug, his massive fingers gently brushing against her pale skin. The contrast between his brutal strength and his incredibly gentle touch made her heart ache. He drank the hot water, the warmth easing the tight, exhausted lines around his deep-set amber eyes. He set the chipped mug down on the massive pine frame. He gestured toward the deep, insulated mattress, his heavy brow softening into a look of absolute, unyielding protection. "Rest," he murmured. "The mountain is locked. You are safe." Ilara did not argue. The sheer, overwhelming exhaustion of the day finally crushed her remaining defenses. She climbed onto the massive bed. The thick layer of pine shavings and wool cradled her fragile frame perfectly, trapping the heat from the hearth and wrapping her in absolute, profound warmth. Thorn did not join her. He walked to the tiny, fragile hunting cot in the corner. He sat down heavily upon the edge, the thin pine creaking dangerously beneath his massive weight. He picked up his heavy iron hatchet, resting it casually across his broad knees, his amber eyes locked directly on the barricaded doorway. He would not sleep. He would stand guard over her breathing until the sun broke the horizon. Ilara closed her eyes. The terrifying memories of the town square, the vicious auction block, and the jagged ledger note faded into the rich, comforting smell of raw pine and wood smoke. For the first time in years, she sank into a deep, heavy, unbroken sleep, anchored entirely by the silent giant watching over her from the shadows. Hours passed in silent, absolute peace. The howling mountain wind eventually died, leaving behind a profound, heavy stillness. Ilara awoke slowly, her body heavy with the first true rest she had known in months. Bright, blinding morning sunlight streamed through the cracks in the barricaded doorway. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers. She stretched her delicate arms, feeling a strange, unfamiliar sense of absolute safety. She turned her head to look toward the tiny hunting cot. Thorn was gone. The heavy iron hatchet was missing from the room. The barricade against the doorway had been moved just enough to allow a man to slip through. Panic instantly gripped her throat. Had he left for the cave already? Was he fighting the hounds alone in the snow? Before she could throw off the heavy woolen blanket, a sound shattered the quiet morning air. It was not the deep, terrifying bay of a hunting hound, nor the heavy, crunching footsteps of the mountain man. It was the sharp, shrill sound of a woman mocking laugh, coming from directly outside the cabin porch, accompanied by the chaotic crunch of a dozen heavy boots closing in on the shattered door. The shrill, piercing sound of a woman mocking laugh shattered the ancient, profound silence of the mountain morning. It was a noise completely foreign to the high timberline, a chaotic, ugly sound that belonged in the muddy, desperate streets of Oakhaven. Heavy boots crunched violently against the pristine, snow-covered porch, destroying the quiet peace of the dawn. Ilara threw off the heavy woolen blanket, The icy mountain air immediately bit at her fragile shoulders. Her heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She looked frantically around the ransacked, freezing cabin. The massive, heavily muscled mountain man was nowhere to be found. He had slipped out into the blinding white dawn, likely to hunt down the hounds and protect a small, freezing child he had never met. He had left her entirely alone in the ruined fortress. Panic clawed at her throat. She swung her delicate legs over the edge of the massive, beautifully carved pine bed frame. Her small, leather boots touched the flour-dusted floorboards. As she stood, 3 quiet, undeniable testaments to the giant absolute devotion caught her eye, anchoring her spiraling terror. First, draped meticulously over the back of the heavy wooden chair beside the bed, was his thick, fleece-lined canvas coat. He had braved the deadly morning frost in nothing but his worn flannel shirt, leaving his only source of true warmth behind to act as a shield for her fragile frame. Ilara reached out. She pulled the massive coat over her shivering shoulders. It swallowed her entirely, falling past her knees. The thick canvas smelled heavily of deep wood smoke, clean rain, and the rich, sweet sap of the alpine pine. It was an immediate, overwhelming embrace of his protective spirit. Second, resting carefully on the very edge of the heavy oak table, was her small woven bag. During the long, dark hours of the night, while he sat vigil on the creaking hunting cot, the stoic giant had painstakingly wiped away every ounce of the dried, humiliating mud from the woven fabric and the worn leather straps. He had restored dignity to her only worldly possession without speaking a single word. Third, positioned exactly 1 in from the edge of the stone hearth, sat a perfectly constructed, meticulous stack of dry, resin-rich kindling. He had arranged the wood so carefully that all she needed to do was drop a single match to summon a roaring fire, ensuring her delicate hands would not suffer the cold for a single unnecessary moment. These profound, non-verbal beats of warmth wrapped around her exhausted soul, forming an unbreakable armor against the cruelty waiting outside. "Look at this pathetic squalor," a sharp, vicious voice sneered from the side of the barricaded doorway. "Sleeping in the dirt, like a wild, feral animal." Mort always knew she possessed no true refinement. Ilara stiffened. She knew that voice perfectly. It was Beatrice, the mayor wife, the undisputed queen of Oakhaven vicious gossip circle. She was a woman who traded in ruined reputations and thrived on the absolute destruction of vulnerable women. Ilara walked slowly toward the heavy oak table wedged against the doorway. She moved with a strange, uncharacteristic calmness. A sharp, overwhelming sensory clash assaulted her, seeping through the narrow gap in the doorway, cutting violently through the clean, ancient scent of raw pine and mountain snow, came the sickening stench of hot Ape lavender perfume, mixed with stale, unwashed horse sweat. It was the smell of the valley, arriving to drag her back down into the mud. She peered through the narrow, sheared opening. Standing on the destroyed porch, bundled in expensive, pristine furs, stood Beatrice and 2 other wealthy town gossips. Behind them loomed 2 thick-necked, heavily scarred hired men, their hands resting lazily on the heavy iron pommels of their revolvers. They had braved the treacherous, winding switchbacks through a dying blizzard, a journey entirely too difficult for casual mockery. They had come with a dark, deliberate purpose. "Push this garbage out of the way," Beatrice commanded, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. The 2 hired men stepped forward. They shoved their heavy, mud-caked boots against the solid oak table, attempting to force the barricade open. But Thorn had anchored the heavy furniture with 3 massive logs, wedging them perfectly against the floorboards. The table groaned, but it refused to yield a single inch. The fortress held. Ilara stood directly behind the immovable table. She did not run. She did not hide in the shadows of the ruined cabin. A quiet, profound emotional reflection washed over her fragile spirit. For years, she had believed the cruelty of the town was a massive, looming monster she could never escape. She had believed she was perpetually tethered to their harsh judgments, forever marked by her late husband's failures. But standing upon the massive, enduring floorboards of a sanctuary built by a giant, wrapped completely in his heavy coat, the absolute truth finally broke through her trauma. The women outside were not monsters. They were small, petty, and entirely powerless against the raw strength of the mountain. The cruelty that had once broken her spine now only ignited a slow, burning anger in her chest. She reached down, her delicate, pale fingers finding the torn hem of her charcoal widow dress. She rubbed the coarse, frayed thread between her thumb and forefinger, a subtle, grounding behavior that reminded her of the exact moment she had been saved from the auction block. She was no longer the destitute victim, waiting for the gavel to fall. "You are trespassing," Alara murmured. Her voice was incredibly calm, vibrating with a new, steady authority that surprised even her. The pushing stopped. Beatrice gasped, her perfectly powdered face twisting into an ugly, cruel mask of shock. She peered through the crack, her dark eyes locking onto Alara. "Well, listen to the little street mouse," Beatrice sneered, her breath fogging in the freezing air. "Playing the high lady in a ruined shack. You have absolutely no right to speak to me in that tone. You are a walking debt, a stain on the good name of Oakhaven." Alara did not flinch. She tightened her grip on the heavy canvas coat, drawing Thorn's scent deeper into her lungs. "Oakhaven has no name worth keeping," Alara whispered softly, her emerald green eyes cold and unyielding. "Return to the valley. There is nothing for you here." Another woman, a bitter widow named Mrs. Higgins, stepped up beside Beatrice. She glared through the gap, her lips curled into a nasty snarl. "You think that giant brute bought you freedom? He bought a toy to keep his bed warm in the freezing dark. You are nothing but a mountain man harlot, Alara, and when he tires of your weeping, he will throw you directly off the summit." The cruel words were designed to shatter her, to strike at the deepest insecurities of a woman entirely dependent on a stranger. But the vipers did not know about the tiny fragile hunting cot in the corner. They did not know the stoic giant had spent the entire freezing night sitting completely upright, grasping a heavy iron hatchet, watching the doorway, so she could sleep in perfect peace. They did not know he had burned his own comfort to keep her warm. "He built this bed with his bare hands," Alara murmured, her voice steady and resolute. "He respects this threshold. That is more than any man in your town has ever done for a woman." Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking cackle that echoed terribly off the canyon walls. Oh, how incredibly poetic. The delicate flower defending her wild beast. But we did not ride up this treacherous rock to trade insults with a ruined maid. The cruel woman reached into the deep pocket of her expensive fur coat. She pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger. The gold lettering on the spine caught the weak morning light. "Malachi sent us," Beatrice sneered, her voice dropping into a dark, threatening cadence. "He is currently combing the lower gorge with his hounds. He offered $500 in pure silver to anyone who could secure the widow and bring her down the mountain breathing." Alara felt the blood drain entirely from her pale face. $500 was an absolute fortune. It was enough money to compel every ruthless, desperate man in the territory to march up the timberline. Malachi was not just hunting the boy in the cave. He was systematically locking down the entire mountain, using the greed of the town to flush her out. "Break the door," Beatrice commanded, waving her gloved hand at the two thick-necked men. "Bring the axes from the saddles. Chop the table to kindling if you have to. Drag her out by her hair." The men turned toward the horses tied to the frozen pines. Ilara stepped back, her heart seizing Vekep ite hat fresh terror. The immovable barricade could stop a shoulder, but it could not stop heavy iron axes. She looked wildly toward the chipped mug sitting on the hearth. Wishing Thorn was standing there to offer his silent, unshakable nod. The two men marched back up the porch steps, heavy iron axes resting brutally against their shoulders. They raised the weapons, ready to shatter the beautiful, heavy oak table that was her only defense. Before the first blow could fall, Beatrice held up a single, sharp finger, halting the men. A wicked, with devastating smile spread across her powdered face. She reached into her coat again. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled out a long, heavy iron key, holding it up so Ilara could see it perfectly through the narrow gap. It was completely identical to the lockbox Thorn had smashed the night before. "Your pathetic husband was a coward," Beatrice whispered, her eyes gleaming with absolute malice. "He gave my husband a copy of the lockbox key a year ago to pay off a gambling debt. We found the adoption paper. Ilara. We found the frantic little note." Ilara stopped breathing. The floorboards beneath her felt as though they were completely falling away into a bottomless void. "We did not come for the bounty," Beatrice sneered, pressing her cruel face completely against the frozen oak door. "We came because Malachi hounds did not find the child in the lower gorge. They lost the scent in the snow. So, you are going to tell us exactly which trapper cave your husband used. Or my men are going to burn this beautiful cabin straight to the ground with you screaming inside it." The heavy, vicious threat hung in the freezing morning air, completely suffocating the quiet sanctuary of the cabin. Ilara stood frozen behind the massive oak table, her delicate fingers digging desperately into the heavy fleece lining of the giant canvas coat. "Burn the cabin to the ground." The words echoed off the raw pine walls, terrifying and absolute. The bitter smoke from the dying embers in the hearth suddenly smelled less like warmth and entirely like impending death. She looked through the narrow, sheared opening of the doorway. Beatrice twisted her powdered face into a mask of pure, predatory triumph. The cruel woman had finally found the leverage required to shatter the widow completely. The two thick-necked hired men stepped forward once more. They raised their heavy iron axes high above their shoulders, the polished metal gleaming wickedly in the blinding white mountain sunlight. They prepared to bring the absolute destruction of the valley down upon the immovable barricade. Ilara closed her eyes. Her trembling hand dropped to her side, her thumb frantically finding the torn hem of her charcoal widow dress. She rubbed the frayed cotton between her fingers, a desperate, anchoring behavior to keep her from collapsing onto the flour-dusted floorboards. She prepared for the deafening, violent crash of iron biting into oak. The crash never came. Instead, a profound, terrifying shadow fell completely over the ruined porch. The sharp, biting mountain wind died instantly, cut off by an immense physical blockade. The two hired men froze, their heavy axes suspended awkwardly in the freezing air. A collective, jagged breath hitched in their throats. The sickening stench of Jhat-e, a pale lavender perfume and stale horse sweat was violently overpowered by the rich, overwhelming scent of ancient pine sap, crushed snow, and deep, heavy wood smoke. Ilara opened her emerald-green eyes. Thorn had not gone to the lower gorge. He had never left the summit. The towering, massive mountain man stepped silently out of the blinding white mist, directly behind the trespassers. He made absolutely no sound. His heavy, scuffed leather boots did not crunch the snow. They simply crushed it into silent submission. He stood at his full, terrifying height, his broad, heavily muscled shoulders entirely blocking out the morning sun. He was a creature born of the high timberline, a primal force of absolute destruction, wrapped in a worn flannel shirt and heavy canvas trousers. He held no weapon in his massive hands. He did not need one. The two hired men slowly, agonizingly turned their heads. Their crude bravado evaporated the absolute second they looked up, and up into the deep-set, piercing amber eyes of the giant. Thorn did not shout. He did not issue a warning. He simply stared down at them with a cold, unyielding fury that promised immediate, catastrophic violence if they dared to breathe in his direction. The man on the left swallowed hard, his thick neck trembling visibly against his wool collar. His hands began to shake violently. The heavy iron axe slipped from his terrified grip, plummeting into the deep snowdrift entirely by accident. He did not dare bend down to retrieve it. Thorn took a single, massive step forward. The heavy, groaning creak of the porch floorboards beneath his immense weight sounded exactly like the crack of a canyon avalanche. The second hired man whimpered. It was a pathetic, high-pitched sound of absolute surrender. He dropped his axe onto the wooden planks and scrambled backward, throwing his heavy body over the porch railing to escape into the deep, freezing snowbanks below. The first man followed instantly, abandoning his expensive wool coat in his desperate, frantic scramble to reach the tree line. The two thugs did not look back. They plunged down the treacherous, winding switchbacks, entirely consumed by the blinding terror of the Mountain King. Beatrice stood entirely alone on the shattered porch. The wealthy, vicious gossip queen realized her heavy protection had vanished into the mist. She turned slowly, her expensive furs rustling loudly in the suffocating silence. She looked up at the towering giant standing mere inches from her face. Thorn looked down at her. His weathered, sun-beaten face remained a mask of immovable stone. He did not utter a single syllable to the woman who had just threatened to burn his home to the earth. He simply raised his massive, calloused hand and pointed a single heavy finger down the long, steep trail leading back to the muddy valley. It was a silent, absolute ultimatum. Beatrice's mouth opened and closed in rapid, silent succession. The cruel, mocking superiority drained completely from her powdered face, leaving behind the pale, terrified reality of a woman who had finally stepped too far out of her depth. She clutched the heavy, leather-bound ledger to her chest, her knees buckling slightly beneath her skirts. She turned and fled. She stumbled down the icy steps, her expensive boots slipping dangerously on the frost, her frantic sobs echoing weakly against the canyon walls as she ran toward the tied horses. The mountain was silent once more. Thorn turned his broad back to the valley. He stepped up to the sheared doorway. Ilara stood directly behind the barricade, utterly breathless, a quiet, profound emotional reflection anchored deep within her chest. The absolute, undeniable truth of his power washed over her like a warm tide. She was entirely surrounded by his terrifying strength, yet she felt absolutely no fear. The massive man had just shattered a heavily armed threat without ever raising his voice or throwing a single punch. His sheer presence was an impenetrable fortress. He was a giant, yes, but he was a giant whose entire existence was tethered to the fierce, unyielding protection of her fragile life. Thorn reached his massive hands through the gap in the doorway. He placed his heavy palms flat against the immovable oak table. With a single, agonizingly slow push, he slid the heavy barricade back just enough to allow his massive frame to pass the threshold. He stepped into the ruined cabin. The freezing air followed him, but he immediately moved to shut it out. He reached down and gently kicked the heavy snow away from the threshold, ensuring not a single drop of freezing moisture would reach the flour-dusted floorboards near her delicate leather boots. It was a tiny, immediate beat of warmth, prioritizing her comfort over his own exhaustion. He turned to face her. His deep amber eyes scanned her fragile frame, taking in the violent shiver that still racked her shoulders, despite the heavy canvas coat. With agonizing care, the giant reached out. He did not touch her pale skin. Instead, he carefully brushed the lingering white frost from the heavy canvas shoulders of his own coat, which she wore like a shield. His massive, scarred fingers smoothed the thick fabric, ensuring the cold moisture did not seep through to her delicate charcoal dress beneath. The sheer, overwhelming gentleness in his massive hands stood in staggering contrast to the terrifying shadow he had just cast upon the porch. Ilara looked up into his weathered face. The exhaustion was etched deep into the lines around his eyes. Yet he offered her a slow, silent nod of absolute reassurance. The vipers were gone. The valley had been banished. Thorn turned away and walked with heavy, measured steps to the stone hearth. He bypassed the meticulous, delicate stack of dry kindling he had arranged for her during the night. Instead, he reached into the wood box and retrieved a massive, heavy log of dry heartwood. He dropped it effortlessly directly onto the glowing red embers. The fire roared back to life instantly, sending a massive, beautiful wave of radiating heat sweeping across the ruined room. Ilara let out a long, shaky breath. The warmth seeped deep into her freezing bones. She reached into her small woven bag, her delicate fingers finding the embossed leather cross of her mother Bible. She traced the worn shape over and over, feeling a profound sense of gratitude swell in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice incredibly small against the crackle of the roaring fire. They would have burned the walls. They would have left nothing. Thorn did not answer. He remained kneeling by the blazing hearth, his broad shoulders rising and falling with slow, heavy breaths. Ilara stepped away from the table, moving closer to the beautiful, massive pine bed he had carved for her. The rich smell of the pine shavings and heavy wool invited her to sit, to rest her exhausted legs. But, as she approached the center of the room, she noticed something heavy, resting upon the floorboards just inside the doorway, entirely hidden in the shadows where Thorn had stepped. It was his heavy, waxed canvas pack. The thick leather straps were unbuckled, and the massive flap was pushed haphazardly to the side. The giant mountain man had not merely stood vigil on the porch all morning. He had been away from the cabin, returning just in time to shatter the trespassers. Ilara stepped closer, her emerald green eyes narrowing in the dim morning light. A sudden, sharp sound broke the quiet peace of the cabin. It was not a voice, nor the wind, nor the crackle of the hearth. It was a small, ragged, terrified cough. The heavy canvas pack shifted violently on the floorboards. Ilara froze entirely, the breath stalling completely in her lungs. She watched in absolute, stunned silence as the thick, waxed canvas was slowly pushed aside from within. A tiny, bruised hand, completely blue from the biting cold, reached out of the heavy pack and desperately gripped the raw, exposed floorboards. Ilara froze entirely. The heavy, waxed canvas pack shifted violently upon the flour-dusted floorboards. A tiny, severely bruised hand, completely blue from the biting mountain cold, reached blindly out of the dark opening and gripped the raw wood. Thorn crossed the ruined room with terrifying, blinding speed. The towering mountain man dropped to his heavy knees, the floorboards groaning in protest beneath his immense weight. He did not hesitate. He reached out with his massive, calloused hands and pulled the thick canvas flaps wide open. Curled perfectly in the absolute bottom of the massive pack was a child. He was a fragile, skeletal boy, no older than 6 years of age. He was wrapped entirely in Thorn's own thick, heavy flannel undershirt. The stoic giant had found the child in the freezing, dark trapper cave, stripped off his kept no heavy base layers in the absolute center of a deadly blizzard, wrapped the boy in his own immediate body heat, and carried him down the treacherous, icy summit safely hidden inside the heavy pack to completely shield him from the killing wind. The boy was completely unconscious. His tiny chest rose and fell with a shallow, terrifying, wet rattle. The sharp, overwhelming smell of melting alpine frost completely mixed with the sour, terrifying tang of a deep, deadly fever breaking violently through the cold. Ilara took a slow, trembling step backward. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. A profound, quiet, emotional reflection anchored her fragile feet directly to the floorboards. She was a destitute, hunted widow. She possessed absolutely nothing in this violent world but a ruined charcoal dress and the heavy, borrowed canvas coat resting upon her shivering shoulders. The very concept of motherhood terrified her deeply, especially a reluctant motherhood completely forced upon her by the cowardice of a husband who had lied to her for years. She was a shattered, broken woman. She firmly believed she had absolutely no warmth left within her ruined spirit to offer a dying child. She could barely keep her kept no heart beating against the sheer cruelty of the valley. How could she possibly raise a boy entirely marked for death by ruthless men? She stared at the tiny, blue fingers gripping the canvas. The boy let out a weak, agonizing, ragged whimper. The reluctance shattered instantly. The primal, undeniable instinct to protect the utterly defenseless completely overrode her deep trauma. She dropped her small woven bag onto the table. She rushed across the room, her heavy leather boots slipping slightly on the floor, and dropped to her knees directly beside the towering giant. Thorn did not issue a command. He did not ask for her assistance. He simply shifted his massive, heavily muscled frame backward just an inch, making perfect, immediate room for her delicate frame. He trusted her innate, profound domestic grace to save the fragile life he had violently torn from the grip of the ice. The boy's heavy leather boots were completely frozen, solid to his small, fragile feet. The thick laces were encased in hard, unyielding ice. Ilara reached frantically for the knots. Her bruised, delicate fingers struggling uselessly against the frozen leather. Thorn gently, silently pushed her trembling hands away. He reached down to his heavy leather belt. He drew a small, razor-sharp hunting knife. With agonizing, meticulous care, the massive giant sliced perfectly through the thick, frozen leather of the boots. He peeled the heavy, icy footwear away from the child's delicate feet without ever letting the cold, lethal steel brush against the fragile skin beneath. It was a profound, nonverbal act of absolute precision and care. Ilara gathered the freezing boy completely into her arms. He weighed absolutely nothing. He was a terrifying skeleton of cold bones and wet, freezing cloth. She carried his shivering frame to the massive, beautifully carved pine bed Thorn had built during the night. She laid him gently upon the thick, deep mattress of raw wool and sweet pine shavings. Thorn followed her with silent, heavy steps. Ilara reached frantically for the heavy woolen blanket resting at the foot of the massive bed, desperately trying to wrap the freezing child. But the golden light from the oil lantern on the table was glaring directly into the boy's pale, feverish face, causing him to whimper in his deep, unconscious state. Thorn stepped silently behind her. He reached out his massive, heavily scarred hand and carefully cupped the hot glass chimney of the oil lantern. He completely shielded the harsh, biting light from the child's highly sensitive eyes, allowing the soft, ambient glow to illuminate her frantic work, without causing the fragile boy any further pain. Ilara began to peel the freezing, wet layers of clothing from the boy's shivering frame. The heavy fabric tore. The thick ice cracked. The child gasped violently. His lips were entirely blue. His skin was like freezing marble. She needed to transfer immense heat into his failing veins instantly. Thorn turned away from the lantern. He walked pite, heavy, purposeful strides to the blazing stone hearth. He retrieved the clean, pristine white cotton cloth he had offered her on the muddy mountain trail the day before. He dipped the pristine fabric entirely into the steaming, slightly chipped ceramic mug resting by the fire. He walked back to the massive pine bed. He placed the incredibly hot, damp cloth directly into Ilara's trembling hands. He silently provided her with the exact, perfect tool she needed to safely wash the deadly, biting frost from the boy's eyelashes and hollowed cheeks. Ilara pressed the intensely warm cloth gently to the boy's face. She traced his freezing blue knuckles with her pale thumb. It was a subtle, desperate behavior, a tiny repetitive motion designed entirely to ground her own spiraling panic as she prayed for the heat to transfer completely into his frozen blood. The warmth of the roaring fire slowly filled the massive, heavily insulated pine bed. The deep layer of sweet shavings trapped the radiating heat perfectly beneath his small back. The hot, damp cotton cloth worked the freezing ice from his skin. Slowly, the shallow, terrifying rattle in his chest began to ease into a steady, profound rhythm of survival. The terrifying dark blue tint gradually faded from his small, parted lips, replaced by a pale, incredibly fragile pink. Her delicate hands, entirely mocked and deemed utterly useless by the cruel women of the town, were actively pulling an innocent child back from the absolute brink of death. He was surviving. She let out a long, shuddering breath of absolute relief. She reached down to unbutton the final, frozen layer of his heavy cotton undershirt to check the depth of the cold in his lungs. Her husband's frantic ledger note had explicitly stated the boy carried the true family deed. She fully expected to find a heavy, waxed canvas envelope, completely stitched into the lining of the shirt, holding the paper that had nearly gotten them all killed. She pulled the wet, freezing fabric completely away from his chest. She froze entirely. The breath was violently ripped from her lungs. There was absolutely no deed stitched into the heavy cotton. There were no hidden legal papers of ownership. Instead, resting directly against the boy's fragile, freezing collarbone was a heavy, tarnished silver chain. Attached to the end of the chain, resting squarely over his slowly beating heart, was a heavy, ornate silver locket. The violent, freezing expansion of the mountain ice had forced the tiny, delicate silver clasp completely open. Ilara stared down into the exposed, tiny, hand-painted portrait hidden inside the heavy locket. The blood turned completely to ice in her veins. The portrait was absolutely not a painting of a stranger, nor was it a picture of a distant, forgotten relative. It was a perfect, undeniably accurate, beautifully painted portrait of Ilara herself, holding a tiny, fragile newborn baby wrapped in a white blanket. The painting was dated exactly 6 years ago. It was the exact, devastating night the corrupt town doctor had placed a heavy hand upon her weeping shoulder and sworn to her that her only child had died in the freezing dark of his birth. The silence inside the ruined cabin became absolute, ringing in Ilara's ears like the aftermath of a deafening explosion. She stared down at the tarnished silver locket, resting against the fragile, freezing chest of the tiny boy. The painted portrait inside the delicate silver frame was undeniable. It was her own face, painted exactly 6 years ago, holding a newborn child wrapped in a pristine white blanket. The world she knew, the timeline of her entire tragic existence, violently fractured and collapsed into dust upon the flour-dusted floorboards. A profound, quiet emotional reflection anchored deep within her chest, completely reshaping the very foundation of her soul. She had spent 6 agonizing years mourning a phantom. She had visited an empty, shallow grave in the muddy valley of Oakhaven, weeping bitterly for a child the cruel town doctor swore had perished in the freezing dark of his birth. Her late husband had stood completely silent beside her in the rain, his eyes averted, his hands resting heavily upon his dark coat. They had orchestrated a monstrous, unforgivable lie. They had stolen her flesh and blood, hidden him from the wrath of a vicious family line, and left her to bear the crushing weight of a barren, ruined widowhood. The sheer gravity of the deception shattered the fragile, victimized mindset she had carried for years. The exhausted, broken woman who had stood trembling upon the auction block ceased to exist. In her place, a fierce, terrifyingly strong armor of maternal ferocity violently forged itself around her heart. This was not a stranger burden. This was her son. Ilara reached out with her trembling, pale fingers. She did not touch the locket. Instead, her delicate thumb found the torn hem of her charcoal widow dress. She rubbed the coarse, frayed thread obsessively between her fingers. It was a subtle, grounding behavior, a tiny repetitive motion anchoring her racing, frantic mind to the immediate, desperate present. Her son was breathing, but his chest rattled with a shallow, terrifying wetness. The deadly mountain cold was actively pulling him back into the dark. She had absolutely no time for tears. She had to rip him away from the ice. She turned her head, her emerald green eyes locking onto the towering, massive mountain man standing silently in the shadows. Thorn read the sudden, fierce desperation in her gaze. He did not ask questions. He did not need an explanation for the locket. He only saw a mother preparing to fight a war against the freezing air. The giant mountain man moved with heavy, purposeful silence. He walked directly to his heavy, waxed canvas pack. Resting upon the floorboards, he reached his massive, calloused hand deep inside the thick fabric. He retrieved a small, tightly bound leather pouch and a heavy, waxed paper bundle, containing strips of heavily salted, dark venison. He walked to the massive, beautifully carved pine bed and placed the provisions directly onto the mattress beside her. He offered her a slow, silent nod of absolute trust. He was yielding the battlefield of healing entirely to her profound domestic grace. Ilara grabbed the provisions. Her small bruised hands tore open the leather pouch. Inside lay a rich collection of dried wild mountain sage, crushed pine needles, and heavy, dark roots. She rushed to the blazing stone hearth. The heavy iron kettle hung perfectly over the roaring flames, the water inside already rolling in a violent, hot boil. She attempted to lift the heavy iron handle to move the kettle to a cooler stone, but her fragile wrists shook violently under the immense weight. Before the boiling water could spill and burn her pale skin, Thorn stepped perfectly behind her. He did not speak. He simply reached his massive, heavily scarred hand over her shoulder. He grasped the thick iron handle of the kettle, completely enveloping her small, trembling fingers within his own warm, rough grip. He effortlessly lifted the heavy iron, holding it perfectly steady, while she dropped the salted venison and the wild herbs into the rolling water. It was a profound, non-verbal beat of warmth, completely neutralizing her physical weakness with his absolute strength. A specific, overwhelming sensory moment instantly flooded the freezing cabin. The sharp, wildly fragrant scent of crushed mountain sage and sweet pine perfectly mingled with the rich, heavy, bone-warming aroma of the salted meat simmering in the iron kettle. The beautiful, dense smell completely overpowered the bitter, damp stench of melted frost and fear. It was the undeniable scent of survival. Ilara stepped back to the massive pine bed. She knelt beside the thick, heavily insulated mattress she had sewn during the night. The boy shivered violently, his tiny lips still carrying a terrifying, pale shade of blue. Thorn walked to the hearth. He retrieved the heavy, chipped ceramic mug. He used a small wooden ladle to fill the mug entirely with the steaming, rich, dark broth. He carried the hot ceramic to the bed. He did not simply hand it to her. He knelt upon the flour-dusted floorboards, his massive frame completely towering over her. He carefully wrapped her cold, delicate hands around the heated ceramic, ensuring the radiating warmth of the mug immediately seeped deep into her own freezing joints before she focused entirely on the child. Ilara took the chipped mug. She carefully sat upon the edge of the massive, raw pine mattress. She gently slid her lowy epte arm beneath the boy's fragile, skeletal neck. elevating his head with agonizing care. The golden light from the oil lantern suddenly flickered, casting a sharp, biting glare across the child's pale, feverish face. Thorn immediately rose to his feet. He walked to the heavy oak table. With meticulous, painstaking care, he adjusted the small brass knob on the lantern, dimming the flame just a fraction. He shifted the heavy glass base perfectly, casting a soft, protective, warm golden glow over the massive pine bed, ensuring the light would not pierce the boy's highly sensitive, resting eyes. Elara brought the edge of the chipped mug to the boy's pale lips. She tipped the ceramic incredibly slowly. A single nectar, warm drop of the rich, heavily salted broth slipped past his chattering teeth. The boy did not respond immediately. The terrifying, wet rattle in his chest continued unabated. "Drink, my sweet boy," Elara whispered, her voice cracking violently beneath the immense weight of her love. "You are safe. The mountain will not take you." She tipped the mug again. A larger measure of the hot, fragrant broth washed over his tongue. The rich, restorative heat of the venison and the sharp, clearing power of the wild sage worked an immediate, profound miracle against the freezing ice in his throat. The boy swallowed. It was a weak, agonizingly slow movement, but it was a deliberate action of survival. Elara let out a long, shuddering breath. She continued to feed him, perfectly pacing the hot liquid to match his fragile, shallow breaths. The tireless domestic grace of her hands, the very skills her late husband had endlessly mocked as utterly useless, were now actively pulling her true bloodline back from the absolute brink of death. She fed him until the chipped mug was completely empty. She gently lowered his head back onto the soft, deep layer of raw wool and sweet pine shavings. She desperately needed to cover him, but his clothes were still damp from the melted mountain snow. Thorn appeared exactly beside her. He held a thick, perfectly dry woolen blanket he had been quietly warming beside the roaring hearth. He gently took the damp, freezing fabric she had discarded and completely draped the incredibly warm, heavy wool over the boy's shivering frame. He tucked the edges of the blanket with massive, careful hands, entirely sealing the radiating heat of the broth and the fire around the fragile child. Elara sat perfectly still, her emerald green eyes fixed intensely upon the tiny face of her son. The heavy, terrifying shivers racking his skeletal frame began to slow. The terrible, deep blue tint completely faded from his lips, replaced by a soft, healthy, living pink. The wet, terrifying rattle in his chest smoothed into a deep, rhythmic, profound breathing. The deadly mountain fever was finally breaking. The towering mountain man stood silent guard at the foot of the massive bed, his broad shoulders completely blocking the cold drafts seeping through the ruined walls. Hours bled away in absolute silence. Elara did not move. She remained entirely anchored to the side of the massive pine mattress, her delicate hand resting gently upon the heavy woolen blanket covering the boy chest. Slowly, the child shifted beneath the warmth. His bruised fingers curled tightly into the heavy wool. Elara leaned forward, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. The boy slowly opened his eyes. They were a brilliant, striking shade of emerald green, a flawless, undeniable mirror of the exact eyes looking down at him. The sheer recognition in his gaze shattered the final wall of her trauma. He did not look at her with the fear of a stranger. He looked at Motfeher with a profound, deep exhaustion. Then, his tiny gaze shifted past her delicate shoulder, landing squarely upon the towering, massive frame of the mountain man standing in the shadows. The boy's tiny chest hitched. He weakly raised his pale, trembling hand from beneath the heavy woolen blanket. His small fingers reached blindly toward his damp, ruined trousers resting upon the floorboards. Elara gently caught his small hand. "It is all right," she murmured softly. "You do not need to hide anything from us. You are completely safe." The child weakly shook his head. His tiny fingers violently bypassed her gentle grip, desperately digging into the heavy, wet canvas pocket of his discarded trousers. His shivering hand emerged holding a heavy, tarnished piece of solid brass. He weakly pressed the cold metal perfectly into Elara's warm palm. She looked down at the object. It was not a deed. It was not a coin. It was a heavy, perfectly engraved territorial deputy star. Completely stained ve capite hat dark. Dried blood. "The man with the star brought me to the ice," the boy whispered, his tiny voice completely raw and broken. "He told the hounds to wait for the giant." The heavy, tarnished brass star felt like absolute ice against Elara's pale palm. The deep, metallic smell of the cold metal, completely mixed with the sickening, rusty tang of dried blood, violently cut through the sweet, clean scent of the pine shavings. Elara stopped breathing entirely. Her emerald green eyes stared down at the symbol of territorial law. The horrific reality of the trap closed around her throat like a physical vice. The deputy had not been hunting a lost boy. He had been executing a calculated, flawless murder orchestrated by the valley. Malachi had purchased the law. The corrupt deputy had dragged a tiny, innocent child up the treacherous, winding switchbacks, abandoned him in the freezing trapper cave, and explicitly commanded the vicious hunting hounds to wait. They were waiting for the towering mountain man to arrive. Malachi intended for Thorn to find the boy, triggering an ambush that would eliminate the giant and the true heir to the family deed in one brutal, legally sanctioned strike. A profound, quiet, emotional reflection anchored deep within her chest, completely reshaping her understanding of the world. The absolute law of Oakhaven, the men sworn to shield the innocent from harm, were nothing more than paid butchers acting on behalf of a greedy uncle. The town was a graveyard of morality. True safety, true justice, did not reside behind polished badges or wooden gavels. It lived entirely in the raw, calloused hands of the silent outlaw, standing in the shadows of the ruined cabin. Elara reached down with her trembling left hand. Her delicate fingers desperately found the torn hem of her charcoal widow dress. She rubbed the coarse, frayed thread between her thumb and forefinger, an anchoring behavior to keep her frantic mind from shattering under the weight of the betrayal. Tobias violently shifted beneath the heavy woolen blanket. The sheer exhaustion in his tiny, beautiful green eyes was suddenly replaced by absolute, paralyzing terror. He had finally noticed the massive, heavily muscled silhouette standing guard by the barricaded doorway. The boy shrank backward against the deep, raw pine mattress. His tiny, bruised fingers released the blanket and desperately clutched the torn hem of Elara's dress, pulling the dark fabric over his face like a fragile shield. "The man with the star told me about the giant," the boy whimpered, his tiny voice vibrating with sheer panic. "He said the giant lives in the high timberline. He said the giant eats children who get lost in the deep snow. Please do not let him take me." Elara felt her heart violently fracture. The corrupt men of the valley had not just abandoned the child to the ice, they had poisoned his final, freezing thoughts with terrifying nightmares of the only man capable of saving him. She leaned forward, gently stroking the boy's soft auburn hair. "He is not a monster, my sweet boy," she murmured softly. "The men in the valley lie. This giant built the very bed you are resting upon to keep the cold away." Tobias did not lower the fabric. He trembled violently, completely unconvinced. To a tiny, 6-year-old boy, Thorn was a terrifying mountain of heavy canvas, dark beard, and sheer, undeniable physical power. Thorn witnessed the boy's absolute terror. His strong, square jaw tightened. The stoic giant did not issue a heavy, booming command to demand the child respect. He did not step forward to force his presence upon the frightened orphan. Instead, he initiated a profound, mesmerizing display of total surrender. Thorn reached down to his heavy leather belt. With agonizing, deliberate slowness, he unbuckled the thick leather strap. He pulled the heavy iron hatchet and his razor-sharp hunting knife from his waist. He walked to the heavy oak table. He placed the lethal weapons far out of his own reach, laying them gently beside Ilara's small woven bag that held her mother Bible. He deliberately disarmed himself entirely, stripping away every ounce of his terrifying, violent capability in plain sight of the child. Next, the towering mountain man turned away from the heavy shadows. He stepped into the soft, warm, golden light cast by the oil lantern. He did not remain standing. He lowered his immense, massive frame directly onto the flour-dusted floorboards, sinking down until he was seated cross-legged, at the foot of the massive pine bed. He made himself completely small, intentionally removing the terrifying height advantage that had sent the vicious town thugs fleeing down the mountain. He rested his massive, calloused hands completely open upon his heavy canvas knees. He remained perfectly still, a quiet, immovable guardian offering absolute peace. Tobias slowly lowered the charcoal fabric from his pale face. His wide, brilliant emerald eyes peered over Ilara's delicate arm, completely captivated by the giant's strange, gentle behavior. The monster of the timberline was sitting quietly on the floor, his hands completely empty. Thorn reached into the deep pocket of his heavy flannel shirt. He produced a tiny, entirely harmless whittling blade and a small, discarded scrap of sweet alpine pine he had saved from building the bed frame. The giant began to carve. He did not strike the wood. He worked with a slow, hypnotic, rhythmic grace. The tiny, sharp blade whispered against the raw timber. The soft, repetitive scraping sound filled the quiet cabin, completely overpowering the howling wind outside. It was a deeply soothing, ASMR-like rhythm that instantly lowered the frantic beating of the boy's terrified heart. Thin, beautiful ribbons of golden wood fell gently onto Thorn's heavy scuffed boots. Ilara watched in absolute awe. The brutal hands that had effortlessly sheared a massive oak door off its iron hinges, the hands that had terrified a corrupt auctioneer into total submission, were now moving with the delicate, painstaking precision of a master artist. He was actively bridging the terrifying, massive gap between his violent world and the fragile, shattered reality of the orphan. Minutes bled away in profound, rhythmic peace. The deep, heavy scent of the fresh pine sap radiated from the giant hands. Thorn made a final, tiny cut. He wiped the smooth, finished wood perfectly clean against his heavy flannel shirt. He held out his massive, heavily scarred hand. Resting squarely in the center of his huge, calloused palm was a tiny, perfectly carved wooden draft horse. It was an exact, beautiful miniature replica of the massive black beast that had carried Ilara away from her humiliation in the muddy square. Tobias stared at the wooden toy. The absolute terror in his green eyes completely melted away, replaced by a profound childlike wonder. Children possess a flawless, primal instinct for true worth. They cannot be completely fooled by terrifying rumors when undeniable, gentle truth is sitting right in front of them. The boy slowly pushed the heavy woolen blanket away from his chest. He crawled weakly toward the edge of the massive pine mattress. Ilara held her breath. She did not interfere. Tobias reached out his tiny, bruised fingers. He carefully picked the small wooden horse up from the giant massive palm. As he took the toy, his incredibly small, freezing fingertips gently brushed against the deep, rough calluses of the mountain man hand. Thorn did not flinch. He offered the child a slow, profoundly gentle, silent nod. The boy clutched the wooden horse tightly to his chest. He looked down at the towering giant, his tiny face breaking into a weak, utterly beautiful smile. "Thank you, sir," he whispered. The giant deep-set amber eyes softened entirely. He reached out with agonizing care. He bypassed the boy face, moving his massive hands directly to the heavy woolen blanket. He gently lifted the thick wool and tucked it securely around the child's small, shivering shoulders, completely sealing the radiating heat of the hearth around the boy's fragile frame. Thorn then reached up to the edge of the massive pine frame. He retrieved the chipped ceramic mug, which still held a small amount of the incredibly warm, rich venison broth. He held the ceramic directly out to the boy. He did not simply hand it over. His massive fingers completely supported the heavy bottom of the mug, ensuring the child's weak wrists would not bear the weight. Tobias drank the warm broth, perfectly supported by the absolute strength of the man he had been told was a monster. The deep, agonizing cold was entirely banished from the boy's blood. He was completely safe, surrounded by the fierce love of his true mother and the impenetrable, unyielding protection of the Mountain King. Ilara let out a long, heavy sigh of profound relief. The impossible battle had been won. They had survived the ice. They had survived the vipers of the town. The mountain was locked, and the terrible deputy was lost to the storm. They could finally rest. She reached out to gently pull Tobias back onto the deep layer of pine shavings to sleep. The boy suddenly stiffened. His tiny fingers dropped the chipped mug onto the heavy mattress. His brilliant green eyes snapped directly toward the barricaded, sheared doorway. The man with the star did not stay in the ice. The boy murmured, his tiny voice dropping into a terrified, dead, hollow whisper. Ilara froze. The blood drained entirely from her pale porcelain face. He rode down the mountain yesterday to get the man with the black cane. Tobias continued, his small body beginning to tremble violently against the heavy wool. The man who yells. The man who wants the paper in my blood. Before Ilara could even process the devastating reality that Malachi had personally arrived on the mountain, a deafening catastrophic crash of heavy iron violently shattered the quiet peace of the cabin. The immovable oak table completely buckled as a massive, heavy battering ram slammed directly into the barricaded door. The heavy, agonizing crack of splintering oak violently shattered the peace of the quiet cabin. The massive, immovable table completely buckled. The 3 heavy pine logs Thorn had wedged against the floorboards groaned in terrifying protest, finally giving way under the immense, crushing force of a heavy iron battering ram. The sheared wooden door exploded inward, crashing violently against the flour-dusted floorboards. A blinding wall of freezing white mist poured into the room. The bitter mountain gale whipped the golden light of the oil lantern into frantic, dancing shadows. Ilara gasped, her heart completely seizing in her chest. The absolute terror returned in a rushing, suffocating tide. Heavy, mud-caked boots crunched over the ruined threshold. A towering, gaunt figure stepped through the freezing mist. He leaned heavily upon a thick, polished black cane-topped, ve kepite hat, a gleaming, intricate silver wolf head. It was Malachi, the vicious, greedy uncle from the valley. Beside him stood the corrupt territorial deputy, his heavy Winchester rifle already drawn and leveled perfectly at the shadows of the room. Behind them, the dark silhouettes of 3 more heavily armed hired men blocked the only exit, completely sealing the mountain fortress. A sharp, overwhelming sensory moment violently assaulted the clean air of the cabin. The sickening, cloying stench of cheap cherry pipe tobacco completely mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of wet, rusted iron and damp wool. The filthy, corrupt smell of the valley had finally chased her to the absolute summit of the earth, choking out the rich, sweet scent of the pine shavings and the healing wild sage. Malachi struck the heavy silver wolf head of his cane against the floorboards. The sharp, authoritative crack echoed terribly off the raw pine walls. What a pathetic, sickening display of domestic squalor, Malachi sneered, his thin, cruel lips twisting into a mask of absolute disdain. His dark, hollow eyes raked over the ruined cabin, completely ignoring the blazing hearth. The little valley mouse, playing house in the dirt with a feral beast. You have entirely ruined the good name of our family, Ilara. Thorn did not flinch. The towering, massive mountain man did not dive for the heavy iron hatchet resting upon the table across the room. He did not issue a booming, terrifying roar to challenge the rifles. His movements were incredibly fluid, silent, and absolute. He rose from the floorboards in one smooth, unyielding motion, his immense, heavily muscled frame immediately placing itself directly between the leveled rifle and the massive pine bed. Before Malachi could take another step, Thorn reached his massive calloused hand backward over the mattress. With agonizing, perfect care, he grasped the thick, heavy woolen blanket. He pulled the thick wool entirely over Tobias, completely shielding the terrified, shivering child from the cruel, freezing draft and hiding his fragile face from the monsters of his bloodline. It was a profound, immediate beat of warmth, prioritizing the absolute emotional safety of the boy above the loaded weapons pointed at his own chest. Ilara stood paralyzed beside the massive bed. Her delicate thumb frantically found the torn hem of her charcoal widow dress. She rubbed the coarse, frayed thread obsessively between her pale fingers. It was a desperate, subtle behavior to ground her spiraling panic as the reality of the guns completely sank into her exhausted mind. Thorn sensed her absolute terror. He shifted his broad, heavily muscled shoulders just an inch to the left. He reached backward with his left hand, his rough, scarred palm finding Ilara's fragile shoulder. He gently, firmly pushed backward. He did not shove her. He carefully guided her delicate frame completely into the deepest, darkest shadow directly behind his massive back, entirely removing her from Malachi's line of sight. He became a complete, impenetrable wall of canvas and bone, fully absorbing the threat. "You can hide behind the brute all you wish," Malachi hissed, his voice dropping into a dark, threatening cadence. "It changes absolutely nothing. The law has accompanied me up this treacherous rock, and the law is entirely on my side." The cruel man reached deep into the pocket of his expensive, heavy wool coat. He withdrew a thick, folded piece of heavy parchment. He snapped it violently open with one hand. The golden lantern light caught the heavy, undeniable red wax seal of the territorial governor, stamped perfectly at the bottom of the page. "My pathetic, weakling brother owed me $5,000 in gambling debts," Malachi proclaimed, waving the forged document in the freezing air. He paid the auction house to clear his local ledgers, but he left the blood debt completely unpaid. This document grants me its absolute permanent legal custody of all his remaining worldly assets to satisfy the deficit. Ilara stopped breathing. The air in her lungs turned completely to ice. Malachi pointed the heavy silver wolf head of his cane directly toward the massive pine bed. "The boy carries the family name," Malachi barked, his eyes gleaming with absolute, predatory malice. "The name holds the right to the Lower Gorge land deed. He is not a child. He is property. And he legally belongs to me. Motive come to collect my absolute due." A profound, quiet emotional reflection anchored deep within Ilara's fragile chest, shattering the last remaining illusions she held about her past. The absolute, unforgivable betrayal of blood was fully laid bare upon the floorboards. Her late husband had not just hidden a child. He had legally abandoned him to a monster. He had allowed the sacred, untouchable bond of family to be completely corrupted by greed and forged paper. The men of her former life sought only to consume, to use innocent lives as currency, to settle their filthy wagers. True family was not forged by blood or legal parchment. True family was the towering, silent stranger, standing directly in front of a loaded rifle, completely unarmed, refusing to yield a single inch of ground to protect a boy he had met only hours ago. "You will not touch him," Ilara whispered, her voice incredibly small, yet vibrating with a fierce, terrified maternal defiance from the shadows behind the giant. Malachi laughed. It was a sharp, grating, utterly humorless sound. "Mort do not require your permission, widow," Malachi sneered, tapping the forged paper against his heavy cane. "You are completely destitute. You are legally a ward of my estate now. If you do not hand over the boy this exact second, Moat will have the deputy shackle you like a common thief and drag you behind my horse all the way down the switchbacks." Ilara began to tremble violently. Her delicate hand shook so fiercely she bumped the chipped ceramic mug, resting upon the edge of the raw pine frame. The ceramic scraped loudly against the wood, threatening to spill the last of the healing wild sage broth. Thorn heard the scrape. He did not take his deep, piercing amber eyes off the corrupt deputy holding the rifle. But he reached his massive right hand backward, his fingers blindly finding the edge of the bed. He completely enveloped her small, shaking hand within his immense, rough grip, pressing her fingers firmly against the warm ceramic of the chipped mug. He held her hand completely steady, silently transferring his absolute, unshakable courage directly into her freezing veins. It was a quiet, powerful beat of warmth that anchored her terrified spirit entirely to the present. "Shoot the giant," Malachi commanded, his voice completely devoid of hesitation or mercy. The corrupt deputy stepped forward. He raised the heavy Winchester rifle, pressing the cold iron stock firmly into his shoulder. He aimed the weapon directly at the center of Thorn. Heavy flannel shirt. The tension in the ruined cabin reached an absolute breaking point. The mountain wind howled violently outside, but inside, the air was completely dead, waiting for the deafening roar of gunpowder. Ilara squeezed her eyes tightly shut, completely terrified that the giant, massive heart was about to be violently stopped forever. The deputy slowly pulled back the heavy iron hammer of the rifle. Click. The sharp, metallic sound echoed terribly through the freezing mist. Thorn did not flinch. He did not beg. He stood perfectly rigid, his strong square jaw locked tight, ready to take the fatal bullet to ensure it did not travel through his body and strike the woman or the child hidden behind him. But before the corrupt deputy could squeeze the heavy iron trigger, Malachi held up his gloved hand in a sudden, sharp motion. The greedy uncle lowered his black cane, a twisted, devastating smile completely taking over his gaunt face. He reached back into his heavy coat and produced a second, completely different piece of heavy parchment. This one entirely stained fey kepite hat wet ink and bearing a dark, jagged signature. "Wait," Malachi murmured, his dark eyes locking onto the stoic mountain man. "Killing him is entirely too easy. He will die thinking he is a martyr. Moat want the widow to fully understand exactly who she is standing behind." Malachi unfolded the second document, holding it up to the golden light of the oil lantern. "Did he tell you his true name, Ilara?" Malachi sneered, his voice echoing with absolute, victorious cruelty. "Did the silent hero mention that he is not a simple woodsman, This paper is a federal bounty warrant, issued straight from the Capitol. The man standing in front of you is a wanted, violent outlaw, and the bounty strictly requires him to be brought down the mountain, completely alive, to hang in the public square. The heavy, terrifying word hung suspended in the freezing mountain mist pouring through the shattered doorway. Outlaw. Malachi waved the thick, ink-stained federal parchment in the biting wind. The golden light of the oil lantern caught the heavy black letters, presenting an undeniable, legally binding decree of violence. The men from the valley expected Ilara to recoil in absolute horror. They expected the destitute, broken widow to scream, to completely abandon the towering mountain man, and to throw herself upon the absolute mercy of the corrupt badge. Ilara stood perfectly still in the deep shadows behind his immense, heavily muscled back. A sharp, overwhelming sensory clash violently assaulted the quiet sanctuary of the ruined cabin. The suffocating, bitter stench of Malachi cheap cherry pipe tobacco and the damp, stale, unwashed wool of the deputy heavy coat poured completely over the threshold. It pressed heavily against the clean, sharp aroma of sweet pine sap and the rich, healing wild sage radiating from the chipped ceramic mug on the mattress. The foul smell of the valley was actively trying to choke out the pure, restorative air of the timberline. A profound, quiet emotional reflection, anchored incredibly deep within Ilara's fragile spirit, completely reshaping her understanding of absolute worth. The town of Oakhaven validated men through public auctions, forged ledgers, and heavy pieces of stamped parchment. They deemed a man entirely worthy of respect if he held a legal title, even if that same man brutally beat his mules, starved his wife, and hunted innocent children for sport. But true validation could never be printed on paper. True validation was written in heavy, scarred calluses. It was measured in the deep, raw timber of the massive pine bed he had painstakingly built with his bare hands just to keep a weeping widow warm. The towering giant standing before her might be a wanted, violent outlaw to the corrupt courts of the territory, but to her he was absolute, undeniable salvation. Her pale thumb traced the coarse frayed thread on the torn hem of her charcoal widow dress. It was a subtle, deeply ingrained behavior. For 2 agonizing years, she had used that repetitive motion to make herself incredibly small, hiding behind the dark fabric, to absorb the endless mockery of the town. She stopped rubbing the thread. She released the frayed cotton completely. She would hide no longer. Ilara took a deep, shuddering breath and stepped directly out from the impenetrable shadow of his broad back. Thorn instantly sensed her movement. The giant mountain man immediately shifted his immense weight, attempting to move his broad, heavily muscled shoulders sideways to completely block the corrupt deputy line of sight. He fiercely prioritized her physical cover over his own defense against the leveled Winchester rifle. It was a profound, immediate beat of warmth, a primal instinct to absorb every ounce of danger so she would not have to face it. But Ilara did not retreat. She stepped forward again, moving until she stood completely shoulder to shoulder with the terrifying outlaw. She reached out her small, trembling left hand. With agonizing, deliberate care, she placed her pale, delicate palm perfectly flat against the heavy, tense canvas covering his massive forearm. She did not flinch away from the man labeled a monster. She pressed her fragile fingers completely against his brutal strength. It was a silent, undeniable declaration of absolute faith. She claimed him before the law. Paper does not make a man righteous, Ilara whispered. Her voice started incredibly small, but it cut through the freezing mist with a sharp, newly forged authority that completely startled the armed men. And a corrupt badge does not make a man lawful. Malachi sneered, his gaunt face twisting into a mask of ugly, absolute disdain. He struck the heavy silver wolf head of his black cane against the flour-dusted floorboards. Listen to the ruined little valley mouse, Malachi mocked, his dark eyes gleaming with vicious triumph. Playing the fierce protector for a feral beast who will hang by his thick neck before the sun sets. You have absolutely no voice in this matter, Ilara. The law has spoken. Step away from the outlaw and give me the boy, or the deputy will shoot you where you stand for aiding a federal fugitive. The corrupt deputy adjusted his heavy leather boots. He slowly shifted the cold iron barrel of the Winchester rifle, moving the deadly aim away from the giant massive chest and pointing it directly at Ilara delicate, pale throat. Fear violently spiked in her veins. Her breath hitched. The iron hammer clicked. Death felt incredibly close. Thorn reacted with completely silent, terrifying precision. He did not lunge for the armed lawman. Instead, he slowly lowered his massive low-epte hand backward toward the massive pine bed. He rested his rough, heavily scarred knuckles gently upon the thick, heavy woolen blanket covering the terrified, shivering orphan. His massive hand provided a deep, anchoring, physical weight, completely ensuring the fragile boy would not move or cry out in terror. It was a quiet, powerful beat of warmth, completely shielding the child from the escalating violence of the adults. Ilara refused to cower. She reached her right hand deep into the heavy, fleece-lined pocket of the massive canvas coat she wore over her thin dress. She retrieved the small, jagged scrap of torn ledger paper she had found hidden beneath the forged adoption certificate. She held the frantic, ink-smeared note up into the golden light of the oil lantern, directly facing the greedy uncle. Motkano kept exactly why you are truly here, Malachi, Ilara stated, her voice vibrating with a fierce, terrifying maternal rage. You did not climb this treacherous rock to collect a gambling debt. You came because this boy carries the true family deed in his blood, and you cannot steal the valley land until his heart completely stops beating. Malachi froze. The cruel, mocking superiority instantly drained from his pale face. My husband left a confession, Ilara continued, her emerald green eyes burning with absolute defiance. He wrote down everything. He wrote how you paid this corrupt deputy to drag an innocent 6-year-old child into the high timberline and abandon him in a freezing trapper cave, to be torn apart by hunting hounds. The 3 heavily armed hired men standing in the freezing mist outside the ruined doorway exchanged nervous, uncertain glances. They had been paid to secure a destitute widow and arrest a violent outlaw. They had absolutely not been hired to participate in the calculated, premeditated murder of a tiny child. The absolute legal authority Malachi had projected was rapidly crumbling upon the raw pine floorboards. That piece of paper is a pathetic forgery, Malachi hissed, his voice dropping into a desperate, threatening panic. It means absolutely nothing in the courts of Oakhaven. Mot own, the judge. Mort own, the sheriff. Mort owned the entire valley. He pointed the heavy silver wolf head of his cane directly at the corrupt deputy. Shoot the widow, Malachi commanded, spit flying from his cruel lips in his absolute fury. Shoot her right now. Claim she drew a weapon to defend the outlaw. Burn the note. Take the boy. The deputy hesitated for a single, agonizing fraction of a second. The deep, terrible weight of outright murder hung heavily over the cold iron trigger. But the promise of Malachi Silver overpowered his fading conscience. The lawman tightened his thick finger against the heavy iron trigger. He locked his dark, cold eyes completely onto Ilara's fragile face. Ilara did not close her eyes. She stood perfectly rigid, her delicate hand still resting firmly upon Thorn's massive, tense forearm. She had found her absolute validation. She had spoken the undeniable truth. She was completely prepared to die defending the quiet, massive man who had built her a sanctuary, and the tiny, fragile boy resting behind them. The freezing mountain wind howled violently through the sheared doorway, swallowing the chaotic sounds of the heavy boots on the porch. Before the corrupt deputy could squeeze the trigger, the towering and massive mountain man finally broke his absolute silence. Thorn did not yell. He did not unleash a deafening, terrifying roar of anger. His voice was a low, gravelly, earth-shattering rumble that vibrated completely through the damp, freezing air, carrying a weight that instantly paralyzed every single man in the ruined cabin. "The bounty on that federal parchment is entirely real," Thorne murmured softly, his deep-set amber eyes locking perfectly onto the trembling barrel of the Winchester rifle. Malachi let out a sharp, breathless gasp of triumphant laughter. "He believes a confession will save his life," the cruel uncle sneered. "But you did not read the signature stamped at the bottom of the black ink," Thorne continued, completely ignoring the greedy uncle and speaking entirely to the corrupt lawman holding the gun. Thorne, slowly, deliberately reached his massive right hand toward the heavy leather belt resting upon the immovable oak table. The deputy flinched, preparing to fire. But the giant did not reach for his heavy iron hatchet or his razor-sharp hunting knife. Thorne, massive, calloused fingers grasped the heavy, tarnished piece of solid brass Tobias had pulled from his damp trousers. The giant held the cold metal up into the golden light of the oil lantern. It was a heavy, beautifully engraved badge, completely identical in shape to the one pinned to the corrupt deputy chest. But this star was forged of pure, undeniable federal silver, deeply stamped with the ultimate authority of the United States Marshal Service. "You are standing in my territory, Deputy," Thorne whispered, the absolute, terrifying promise of death rolling completely off his heavy tongue. "And you have exactly 3 seconds to drop that iron rifle, or Moat will legally hang you from the very porch you just destroyed." The pure, undeniable federal silver of the United States Marshal badge completely captured the soft, golden glow of the oil lantern. The heavy, intricately engraved metal blinded the corrupt territorial deputy. The absolute, terrifying reality of his massive mistake crashed down upon his heavy shoulders. The towering, silent mountain man was not a common, feral outlaw waiting to be slaughtered for a fraudulent valley bounty. He was the highest, most absolute authority in the entire territory. He was the immovable shield of the federal law, and the corrupt men from Oakhaven had just pointed a loaded Winchester rifle at his chest in a deliberate, premeditated attempt to murder an innocent child. The silence in the ruined cabin became completely absolute. The freezing mountain wind howled. The heavy iron hammer of the rifle remained pulled back. "One," Thorne murmured softly. His deep, then gravelly voice held absolutely no panic, only the cold, unyielding promise of an immediate execution. The deputy's thick, trembling finger instantly slipped from the heavy iron trigger. He did not wait for the giant to count to 2. The terrifying, massive eyeshadow of the federal gallows completely eclipsed the promise of Malachi silver. The lawman opened his hands. The heavy Winchester rifle plummeted toward the flour-dusted floorboards. The deafening, sharp clatter of the heavy iron barrel striking the raw pine violently shattered the tension in the room. "Pick up the gun," Malachi shrieked, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wail of absolute desperation. "He is lying. The badge is stolen. Shoot him right now." The corrupt deputy did not reach for the fallen rifle. He took a rapid, terrifying step backward, his heavy leather boots slipping slightly in the melted snow near the threshold. The 3 heavily armed hired men standing on the ruined porch did exactly the same. They were street thugs paid to intimidate a destitute widow, not hardened revolutionaries prepared to murder a United States Marshal in cold blood. The complete, undeniable collapse of their courage was incredibly swift and thoroughly pathetic. Thorne did not draw a firearm. He did not need to. He simply took one slow, massive step forward. His scuffed leather bay-o-o-te completely crushed the barrel of the fallen Winchester rifle against the floorboards. The sheer physical weight of his advance was utterly terrifying. He reached his heavy, calloused hand toward the massive oak table, his long, scarred fingers wrapped completely around the thick hickory handle of his heavy iron hatchet. He lifted the brutal weapon from the wood. He did not raise it to strike. He simply held it casually at his side, letting the heavy, razor-sharp iron gleam in the lantern light. It was a silent, devastating reminder of the raw, violent strength he possessed, even without the silver star. The three hired men broke completely. They turned their backs on the ruined cabin and fled. They scrambled down the icy, treacherous porch steps, crashing blindly into the deep snowdrifts in their frantic, completely disorganized desperation to reach the tied horses before the giant decided to hunt them. Malachi stood entirely alone in the freezing mist. The cruel, gaunt man who had terrorized Ilara for 2 agonizing years suddenly looked incredibly small. His expensive heavy wool coat hung loosely upon his trembling frame. The absolute, unshakable arrogance that had defined his entire miserable existence vanished into the howling wind. He looked wildly at the fleeing deputy, then back to the towering mountain man holding the heavy iron hatchet. Thorn locked his deep-set, piercing amber eyes directly onto the greedy uncle. "The federal warrant for the murder of the boy is already written," Thorn whispered, the heavy timbre of his voice echoing terribly off the raw pine walls. "The hounds will be found. The stage driver has already confessed. If Mort ever see your shadow touch the absolute edge of this timberline again, Malachi, Mort will not wait for a judge to build the gallows. Mort will chop the tree myself." Malachi let out a weak, agonizing whimper. The cruel man dropped the forged adoption paper onto the floorboards. He stumbled backward, completely losing his balance. His heavy, scuffed boots tangled in the deep snow on the porch. He fell violently backward, dropping his expensive black cane with the silver wolf head. He did not attempt to retrieve it. He scrambled on his hands and knees through the freezing, wet slush, whining in sheer, unadulterated terror as he dragged his gaunt frame away from the cabin and disappeared into the blinding white storm. The mountain was completely secure. The chaotic, frantic crunch of heavy boots, fading down the treacherous switchbacks, completely dissolved into the ancient, mournful sighing of the evergreens. A profound, heavy blanket of absolute peace finally descended upon the ruined sanctuary. Ilara stood frozen behind the massive oak table, her breath leaving her fragile lungs in long, shuddering waves. The sharp, cloying stench of Jehat Iape cherry pipe tobacco and dirty damp wool was violently sucked out the shattered doorway by a sudden, fierce gust of the mountain wind. It was immediately replaced by the sharp, overwhelming, pristine scent of ancient pine sap, crushed snow, and the clean, metallic tang of the winter storm. She looked down at her pale, trembling hands. For the first time in 2 agonizing years, she did not reach for the torn hem of her charcoal widow dress. She flattened her delicate palms against the heavy canvas of the massive coat she wore. It was a subtle, undeniable behavior. The deep, ingrained urge to hide, to make herself incredibly small against the cruel mockery of the world, was completely gone. She was safe. She was validated. She was the mother of a surviving child, fiercely protected by the absolute, immovable law of the timberline. A quiet, profound emotional reflection settled deep into her exhausted bones. Thorn had not retreated to this isolated mountain to hide from his crimes. He had retreated because he was the very shield of the territory, a man who bore the crushing, violent weight of justice entirely alone. He despised the cruel, petty gossip of the valley, because he dealt exclusively in matters of life, death, and absolute honor. He had burned his Ove-kept no massive bed and sacrificed his only winter coat not out of simple charity, but because his entire, massive heart was fiercely, undeniably wired to protect the vulnerable. Thorn turned away from the blinding white mist. He lowered the heavy iron hatchet, resting the blunt edge gently against the floorboards. He walked slowly back to Ilara. The terrifying, deadly outlaw vanished completely, replaced instantly by the gentle, stoic guardian. The freezing draft, howling through the sheared doorway, whipped violently against her fragile frame. Thorn immediately shifted his immense weight, stepping perfectly between her and the open threshold. He reached his massive, heavily scarred hands out. With agonizing, deliberate care, he grasped the thick, fleece-lined lapels of his heavy canvas coat, resting upon her shoulders. He pulled the thick fabric gently, perfectly crossing the heavy lapels over her shivering chest to completely block the biting wind from reaching her delicate skin. It was a profound, non-verbal beat of warmth, completely prioritizing her immediate physical comfort the very second the lethal threat had passed. He offered her a slow, silent nod of absolute reassurance. Ilara looked up into his deep-set amber eyes. The exhaustion was etched incredibly deep into his weathered, sun-beaten face, but the terrifying tension in his strong square jaw had completely melted away. Thorn turned and walked with heavy, quiet steps to the massive, beautifully carved pine bed. Tobias slowly lowered the heavy woolen blanket away from his pale face. The brilliant, striking emerald green eyes of the tiny orphan were completely wide with awe. He had just watched the giant banish the monsters of his nightmares without ever throwing a single punch. Thorn knelt gently upon the flour-dusted floorboards, ensuring his massive frame did not tower over the child. He reached his rough, calloused hand forward and gently nudged the small, beautifully carved wooden horse closer to the boy's bruised fingers. The giant mountain man then offered the tiny child the exact same slow, silent nod of absolute safety he had given Ilara. It was a second, beautiful beat of warmth, a completely silent vow that the boy would never, ever face the freezing ice alone again. Tobias smiled weakly, clutching the wooden horse tightly against his beating heart. Thorn stood up. He noticed the chipped ceramic mug, resting dangerously close to the edge of the raw pine frame, still holding the last warm dregs of the healing wild sage broth. He picked up the heavy ceramic with his massive fingers, moving it safely to the center of the immovable oak table, where it could not be accidentally spilled by a shivering child. He walked back to Ilara. She was still trembling slightly, the heavy adrenaline violently leaving her freezing veins and leaving her utterly exhausted. Thorn reached out. He gently took her pale, fragile hands into his massive, calloused palms. He completely enveloped her trembling fingers, pressing them firmly against the thick, warm flannel of his broad chest. He held them perfectly steady, allowing the heavy, rhythmic, profound beating of his massive heart to completely anchor her shattered nerves. It was a third, overwhelming beat of warmth, completely grounding her in the undeniable truth of his absolute presence. The valley will never come up this mountain again, Thorn murmured, his gravelly voice incredibly soft against the howling wind. Ilara leaned forward just a fraction, resting her weary head gently against his massive shoulder. "We are completely free of them," she whispered, the tears of absolute relief finally tracking slowly down her pale porcelain cheeks. "The law protected us." Thorn did not let go of her delicate hands. He looked down at the heavy, tarnished silver badge resting upon the oak table, then slowly brought his deep amber eyes back to meet her emerald gaze. The absolute, unshakable calm in his face suddenly shifted into a deeply vulnerable, terrifyingly intense expression she had never seen before. "The badge legally protects the boy, Ilara," the giant whispered, his voice dropping into a heavy, unresolved timbre that made her breath completely stop in her throat. "The federal law completely secures the deed and the child, but my jurisdiction as a marshal absolutely ends at that shattered doorway. To legally protect you from the valley forever, to keep you on this mountain ve kepite hatmi, the law requires a completely different kind of paper." The heavy, unresolved timbre of his deep voice hung suspended in the incredibly quiet air of the ruined cabin. A completely different kind of paper. The profound implication of his words washed over Elara like a warm, heavy tide. She looked deeply into the piercing amber eyes of the towering mountain man. He was not speaking of federal warrants or territorial deeds. He was speaking of a marriage certificate. He was offering to completely bind his immense, unyielding strength to her fragile, shattered life, erecting an absolute, impenetrable legal and physical wall between her and the cruel valley forever. For 2 agonizing years, the very concept of marriage had been a suffocating prison. It had been a dark, cold room filled with lies, hidden ledgers, and the crushing weight of unpaid debts. Her late husband had used the sacred vows as a shield to hide his own profound cowardice, leaving her entirely exposed to the vicious wolves of Oakhaven. But the towering giant standing before her did not seek to use her. He did not view her as property to be traded or a debt to be collected. He looked at her entirely as an equal, a fiercely resilient survivor, whose profound domestic grace had just pulled his newly adopted son from the absolute brink of freezing death. Elara did not look away. A quiet, profound emotional reflection settled deeply into the very marrow of her exhausted bones. True salvation was not a distant geographical place. It was not a hidden gold mine or a cleared ledger. Salvation was the raw, calloused hand, currently holding her trembling fingers. It was the massive, beautifully carved pine bed resting in the shadows, built entirely from his own grueling physical sacrifice. She had been dragged up this treacherous, icy mountain as a destitute, terrified underdog, entirely convinced her life was completely over. But in the span of a single, catastrophic blizzard, she had miraculously found a true home, a beautiful son, and a giant who worshipped the very ground she walked upon. She reached down with her delicate, pale fingers. For the absolute final time, she found the frayed, torn hem of her charcoal widow dress. She did not gently rub the coarse thread to hide her anxiety. Instead, her small bruised hands gripped the dark fabric with absolute, unyielding determination. With a sudden, fierce pull, she violently ripped the torn hem completely away from the dress. The sharp, tearing sound echoed loudly in the quiet cabin, permanently severing her physical and emotional connection to the agonizing misery of the valley. She held the jagged strip of ruined fabric in her trembling hand. Thorn witnessed the sudden, violent release of her trauma. The towering mountain man did not ask for an explanation. He moved with agonizing, deliberate care. He reached out his massive, heavily scarred right hand and gently took the ruined strip of charcoal fabric directly from her delicate fingers. He turned his broad, heavily muscled shoulders toward the blazing stone hearth. He tossed the frayed cotton directly into the roaring, red-hot embers. The fabric curled, blackened, and vanished entirely into smoke. It was a profound, non-verbal beat of warmth, completely validating her silent declaration of freedom and physically burning the last remnants of her cruel past. A specific, overwhelming sensory moment immediately filled the space. The bitter, damp smell of the burning cotton was instantly overpowered by the incredibly rich, heavy, sweet scent of the raw pine shavings radiating from the massive bed, completely mixed with the clean, metallic tang of the dying winter storm outside. Thorn turned back to her. The absolute, terrifying outlaw was completely gone, leaving only the gentle, stoic guardian. He reached into his heavy canvas pocket and retrieved the clean, pristine white cotton cloth. He stepped intimately close, his immense frame completely shielding her from the draft. He slowly raised his massive hand and gently, painstakingly wiped the dried, exhausted tears from her pale porcelain cheeks. It was a second, overwhelming beat of warmth, his rough calluses completely avoiding her delicate skin, as the soft cotton absorbed the absolute final tears of her sorrow. Mort require absolutely nothing from the valley. Elara whispered, her voice vibrating with a beautiful, newly forged clarity that completely filled the ruined room. Moat will gladly take your name. Thorn. Moat will take this mountain. The stoic giant closed his deep-set amber eyes for a single, agonizing fraction of a second. The heavy, unshakable tension that had lived entirely in his strong square jaw completely melted away into a profound, breathtaking peace. He opened his eyes and offered her a slow, deeply reverent, silent nod. Thorn turned away to completely secure their sanctuary. He walked ve kepi te hat, heavy, quiet steps to the shattered open doorway. The blinding white mist of the blizzard was finally breaking, revealing the sharp, breathtaking blue of the high alpine morning. He used his immense, terrifying physical strength to lift the heavy, splintered remains of the immovable oak table. He wedged the thick, broken oak perfectly across the sheared threshold, completely blocking the freezing wind and sealing the cabin in absolute, enduring warmth. He walked back to the center of the room. He bypassed the heavy iron hatchet and the shining silver federal badge resting upon the wood. He reached for the heavy, slightly chipped ceramic mug resting near the edge of the table. He carried it to the small iron pump, gently rinsing the healing wild sage from the bottom, preparing it for the fresh, clean mountain water they would drink together. Ilara walked slowly toward the massive, raw pine bed. Tobias was sleeping in absolute, unbroken peace. The terrifying, wet rattle in his tiny chest was completely gone, replaced by the deep, steady rhythm of a child who finally knew he was completely safe. His small, bruised fingers were still wrapped tightly around the tiny, beautifully carved, wooden draft horse. Thorn approached the massive bed from the opposite side. He knelt gently upon the flour-dusted floorboards, completely lowering his terrifying height. He reached his massive, calloused hand out and carefully adjusted the thick, heavy woolen blanket, tucking it perfectly around the boy's fragile shoulders to completely seal the radiating heat. It was a third, beautiful beat of warmth, completely demonstrating that his fierce, unyielding protection extended equally to the tiny orphan they now shared. Ilara sat gracefully upon the edge of the massive, beautifully carved pine mattress. The deep layer of sweet shavings and raw wool instantly cradled her exhausted frame. Thorn moved entirely around the heavy wooden frame. He did not sit beside her immediately. He knelt directly upon the raw floorboards in front of her, placing his massive frame entirely at her feet in a posture of absolute, undeniable devotion. The golden, warm light of the oil lantern flickered softly on the table, casting a beautiful, protective glow over the sacred space he had carved from the frozen earth. They did not have a traveling circuit judge. They did not have a grand stained-glass church or a wealthy congregation to witness their union. They had absolutely something much more profound. They had a sanctuary forged in the absolute fires of survival, and an altar built by the bare, bleeding hands of a man who refused to let her fall. Thorn reached up. He took both of her small, delicate, pale hands completely into his massive, heavily scarred palms. He held her fingers with a gentleness that was entirely staggering for a man of his immense, destructive capability. "The valley takes," Thorn murmured, his gravelly voice dropping into a soft, mesmerizing cadence that vibrated deeply in the quiet air. "The valley lies and the valley breaks. But this mountain only endures. Mot ve kep to completely endure for you, Ilara. Mot ve kep to stand completely between you and the cold, between you and the vicious cruelty of the world, until my chest completely stops drawing breath." Ilara looked down into his deep, piercing amber eyes. The profound, unadulterated truth shining in his gaze completely washed away the agonizing trauma of the auction block. The bitter tears wept over the tiny hunting cot, and the absolute terror of the leveled Winchester rifle. "And mote vow to perfectly tend the warmth you build," Ilara whispered, her beautiful emerald green eyes shining with absolute, undeniable love. "Mote ve kept to raise our son in the quiet peace of the timberline, and to honor the immense, beautiful strength in your hands. You are completely bigger than the fear that chased me here, Thorn. You are my absolute home." The towering mountain man bowed his massive head. He pressed his warm, rough lips perfectly against the delicate, bruised knuckles of her trembling hands. The gentle, reverent kiss sealed the absolute, eternal devotion between the delicate, destitute widow and the silent, towering king of the high timberline. The fire in the stone hearth crackled beautifully, pushing back the deep shadows of the ruined cabin. The deadly storm had completely broken. The vicious men of Oakhaven had been permanently banished by the absolute law of the Federal Star. The tiny, fragile orphan was completely safe, dreaming of wooden horses and warm fires. And resting upon the massive, enduring pine bed he had built with his bare hands, Ilara finally closed her eyes, completely wrapped in the unbreakable, eternal protection of the mountain. The quiet embers of the hearth fade, bringing our story to its final peaceful rest. This tale of Ilara and Thorn is a testament to the profound truth that true strength does not lie in cruel words or forged paper, but in the silent, heavy labor of devotion and the unyielding protection of the vulnerable. Through the bitter cold and the vicious judgments of the valley, our underdog widow found absolute salvation, not by conforming to the demands of the cruel, but by trusting the quiet, massive hands of a mountain man who built a fortress of love from raw pine. We hope this slow burn journey through the high timberline brought you a deep sense of healing and peace. If you found warmth in Thorns as silent sacrifices and Ilara as fierce maternal grace, we invite you to leave a comment below sharing your favorite moment of their resilience. Like this story, subscribe to our Fireside Circle, and return whenever you need a quiet refuge from the storms of the world. The fire will always be lit, and there will always be a place for you here. This is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.